Hello, my dear friends. They didn't die from knives, nor from disease. They died from drops of sweet-smelling laudanum called sleeping pills. From aristocratic bedrooms to cramped inns, women disappeared gently, as if in a deep sleep. No one saw them struggle. No one heard them cry for help. Only empty glass jars and sparse photographs remained. Tonight, you will join us in reopening the doors that were locked by the silence of an entire era that was once sold legally and destroyed thousands of people in silence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into the drawing rooms of Victorian London, the first impression would often be of elegance and refinement. Yet behind the polished furniture and soft fragrances stood glass bottles filled with a substance far more dangerous than it appeared. Laudanum, contained in slender, transparent bottles with pastel labels and golden lettering, was not hidden away in cupboards, but placed openly beside perfumes and powders, almost like part of a woman's beauty kit. The presentation was designed to reassure, to make the liquid look like another indulgence of modern life, something clean, safe, and feminine. In reality, each drop was a dose of opium mixed with alcohol, powerful enough to change the mind and weaken the body, a substance that masked its cruelty under the veil of delicacy. It feels almost absurd that poison could be packaged with the same charm as a bottle of rosewater, yet in that world, appearances meant more than truth. The beauty of these bottles was no accident. Apothecaries and manufacturers learned quickly that women trusted what looked refined. Pastel shades suggested gentleness, the glimmer of gold lettering suggested quality, and the clear glass revealed nothing except a liquid that seemed pure. There was no dark warning on the label, no skull or crossbones, no hint that what lay inside could destroy lives. On polished shelves, these bottles looked like part of a fashionable woman's daily routine. They were not medicine in the frightening sense, but accessories, quietly normalized through their appearance. To compare, it would be as if today's cosmetics aisle sold syringes of heroin wrapped in the colours of luxury brands, and shoppers picked them up without a second thought. The marketing of laudanum blurred the line between health and vanity. Women already surrounded themselves with lotions, powders, and fragrances, so one more bottle did not stand out. Laudanum did not come with the heavy smell of chemicals. It had a sweetness, sometimes faintly spiced, enough to feel reassuring. When placed on the dressing table next to a comb and a jar of face powder, it blended seamlessly into the background of daily life. The deception was complete because nobody looking at such an arrangement would imagine it to contain a substance that numbed pain, silenced emotions, and eroded strength. Doctors and chemists reinforced this illusion. They spoke of laudanum in soft terms, calling it a tonic, a solution for sleeplessness, or a balm for female discomfort. By prescribing it in ornate bottles, they gave it an authority that reassured families. Mothers accepted it, wives carried it, and daughters grew up watching it on the shelves at home. There was no public fear around it, only the quiet acceptance that this was part of life. I cannot help but feel unsettled by how ordinary people trusted glass and gold letters more than the reality of what was inside. When families purchased these bottles, they did not feel they were bringing home danger. The shop counters displayed laudanum alongside soaps, syrups, and even scented waters. For a few coins, anyone could buy a bottle that seemed respectable. This ease of access added to the illusion of safety. If something could be bought so freely, it could not be harmful, or so people thought. In fact, the freedom of purchase was one of the reasons the epidemic spread so silently. Women took it in measured sips at first, perhaps for cramps or headaches, and over time the habit became nightly, then daily, until dependence formed without them realizing. The design of the bottle also encouraged this false sense of control. The glass was thin and light, easy to carry. The cork was small, and the liquid poured smoothly. It felt less like taking a medicine and more like consuming a drink or applying a cosmetic. Even the act of holding it was not intimidating. The familiarity bred comfort, and comfort disguised the reality of addiction. In poor households, the same bottle might be reused and refilled, its label fading but its presence remaining constant, as if it were a family object rather than a tool of destruction. Inside those homes, laudanum became part of the background. Women poured a measure before bed, just as they combed their hair or washed their face. Husbands rarely questioned it, because the bottle did not appear threatening. Children saw it without fear, because it resembled nothing more than another jar in the cabinet. In this way, the poison disguised itself not only through appearance but through routine. Addiction thrived in plain sight, hidden not by secrecy but by familiarity. To Victorian families, it looked as harmless as a jar of sweets, when in truth it was more dangerous than any disease in the street. The elegance of the bottle also concealed the scale of its reach. In markets, chemist shops, and parlours, laudanum bottles repeated the same aesthetic, so that across the city, countless homes carried near identical ornaments of destruction. This uniformity meant no household felt unusual in owning them. Respectable women and poor women alike displayed the same neat little containers, and the illusion of normality spread with every purchase. When viewed from outside, society looked polished and refined. But within that polish lay the seeds of decay. Those who questioned the safety were rare, and their voices small. A few reformers argued that opium should not be so freely available, but they were dismissed as alarmists. For every whisper of warning, there were 100 advertisements praising laudanum as a gentle aid. The allure of the bottle silenced doubts. It was easier for families to believe in beauty than to confront the truth of poison. In a culture obsessed with appearances, the glass and gold lettering mattered more than the suffering it caused. The truth, however, revealed itself in symptoms. Women who relied on the nightly dose found themselves weaker, paler, and more withdrawn. Their health declined, but the bottle still looked elegant, still promised relief. Few connected the two. Death certificates listed vague causes like weakness of the heart or exhaustion, never pointing to the pastel-labelled bottle on the nightstand. The design had succeeded in erasing suspicion even in death. Families buried their wives and mothers, believing they had died naturally, while the bottles remained behind as silent witnesses. The contradiction of laudanum in its beautiful disguise was one of the most chilling features of Victorian life. Society prided itself on progress, refinement, and morality, yet tolerated a poison as common as perfume. The elegance of the bottle symbolized the very weakness of the culture, the willingness to value appearance over safety, comfort over truth, habit over awareness. It is not surprising that so many women slipped quietly into dependency, because the very object that harmed them looked like a friend. In the end, these bottles were not just containers, they were symbols of how an empire allowed poison to masquerade as beauty. They represented a failure to distinguish health from danger, progress from destruction. And they remind us that sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones presented with charm and elegance, because people rarely question what looks pure. The first bottles of laudanum brought comfort through their beauty, but behind that elegance was the start of countless tragedies. From these shelves and tables, the habit spread deeper into daily life, entwined with trust in doctors and expectations of women. And as the bottles multiplied, so too did the belief that this drug was not only safe but necessary, a belief that would shape the fate of thousands. Doctors in Victorian London often appeared with calm authority, their voices steady, their prescriptions written with a flourish that gave every word the weight of certainty. Among the remedies they favoured, laudanum was the most common. For ailments ranging from menstrual cramps to headaches, from nervous exhaustion to sleepless nights, the same liquid was poured into the same slender bottles and handed over as if it were the cure to all. There was no hesitation in their choice, no second thought about alternatives. The medicine became a single answer to every question, and women were told to accept it as part of proper treatment. It is darkly amusing that the same men trusted to guard health so often prescribed what slowly dismantled it. The reasoning behind these prescriptions reflected a broader view of women's roles. Doctors believed that women's bodies were fragile, overly sensitive, prone to hysteria and disorder. They argued that calmness and obedience were signs of good character, and that laudanum supported both. A dose could silence complaints, ease tears, and make women more manageable within households that prized quiet above all. This was not about health in the modern sense. It was about social order, and laudanum provided an easy tool to enforce it. If we compare it to now, it would be like physicians routinely handing out sedatives instead of listening to their patients, just to keep workplaces and homes running smoothly. Prescriptions were often written without examination. A woman who described sleeplessness might be handed a bottle without further question. A wife who worried her husband by appearing restless could be told by a doctor that laudanum would ease her nerves. Mothers of young girls were advised that the same medicine could soothe adolescent changes. The drug was presented as safe, almost harmless, something to be taken as casually as a sip of tea. Its danger was minimized, its addictive nature ignored, and its widespread use encouraged by those trained to know better. The effect of such routine prescribing was to normalize dependency. Women did not feel ashamed to take laudanum because it had been recommended by the most respected figures of their society. The bottle on the nightstand was not a secret vice, but a doctor's order. In this way, the line between treatment and addiction blurred until it disappeared. Women were caught in a cycle they had not chosen, guided there by the authority they trusted. I find it troubling that the very people who should have been protectors became the facilitators of decline. For the doctors themselves, there was little reason to question their practice. Laudanum was inexpensive, widely available, and profitable. Prescribing it required little time, which meant they could see more patients in a day. Their reputations benefited when women reported feeling calmer or more restful, at least in the short term. The deeper costs were hidden, unfolding slowly in private rooms long after the prescription had been written. In an age when medical science was still developing, few were motivated to look for hidden dangers when visible results seemed positive. This approach also reflected Victorian attitudes towards suffering. Pain, especially women's pain, was something to be quieted rather than understood. A woman in distress was not seen as a patient with specific needs, but as a disruption to the peace of her household. By prescribing laudanum, doctors gave husbands and families the gift of silence. Complaints lessened, tears faded, and women seemed manageable again. That the price was health and independence was rarely discussed. What mattered was the appearance of order. The stigma surrounding refusal reinforced this pattern. A woman who resisted laudanum could be labelled as difficult or uncooperative. Families trusted doctors more than the patient's own words, so her hesitation might even be taken as a sign of instability. In this way, refusing the bottle could damage a woman's reputation, while accepting it confirmed her as respectable and obedient. The social pressure was immense, and few could withstand it. Most accepted the prescription without protest, believing it was the path expected of them. Inside households, the doctor's word carried enormous weight. If he prescribed laudanum for sleeplessness, then the family treated it as a fact that the medicine was necessary. Women might start with small doses, but as reliance grew, they returned for stronger prescriptions. The doctors, accustomed to repeating themselves, rarely hesitated. Each bottle became another step deeper into dependence, and each new visit reinforced the idea that this was normal. Families grew used to the sight of women sipping from the bottle nightly, until it blended into the routine of domestic life. The patterns spread beyond individual homes. Newspapers carried advertisements for laudanum with quotes from doctors, presenting it as endorsed by the medical establishment. Chemists displayed bottles on their shelves, reminding buyers that this was no illicit product, but a respected treatment. The result was a society where laudanum's dangers were invisible because its respectability was loudly proclaimed. No one questioned the trust placed in doctors, and the doctors themselves rarely questioned their own practices. Over time, the medical community's unquestioned reliance on laudanum shaped how women were seen. Patients became quieter, more subdued, and less engaged. Families praised them for being restful, believing this was a mark of good health. In truth, it was a sign of chemical sedation. Yet doctors used this as proof that their prescriptions worked, and the cycle continued. What began as a medical recommendation became a cultural expectation, until an entire generation of women was lulled into compliance. The silence of medical authorities delayed recognition of the epidemic. Even when some physicians noticed patterns of illness or dependency, their voices were overshadowed by the majority who defended their prescriptions. To admit harm would have been to admit error, and so it was easier to maintain the illusion of safety. Women bore the cost, their health slipping away behind the polished surfaces of bottles that still gleamed with pastel and gold. In the end, the trust placed in doctors became another layer of the tragedy. Women turned to them for help, but instead were given the very substance that chained them. What might have been an opportunity for care became a gateway to dependence. The authority of the medical profession made the epidemic possible because it silenced doubt and disguised harm as healing. The quiet irony is that medicine meant to calm the body ended up destroying it, all under the banner of professional care. Doctors prescribed laudanum for every discomfort, turning suffering into silence rather than healing. Their authority disguised poison as treatment, and women accepted it without question. Yet as the bottles multiplied, the habits that began with medical advice soon slipped into daily routines, creating dependencies no longer tied to illness. Wives in Victorian households carried themselves with the appearance of strength. They cooked meals, cleaned rooms, soothed crying children, and greeted husbands with practiced smiles. From the outside, life looked orderly, even admirable. Yet behind the facade of duty lay a quiet dependency. Each evening before the lamps were dimmed, many women measured out a portion of laudanum. It was no longer a medicine for pain, but a ritual to ensure sleep. A ritual born not of illness, but of fear. They feared the long hours of wakefulness, the thoughts that pressed in when the house grew still, and the emptiness that came from knowing there was no escape. There is something bleakly comic about the idea that a woman praised for her devotion to her family could barely lift her head without her nightly dose. The drug created the illusion of normality. By day, the wives carried out their tasks, moving through kitchens and nurseries with the same practiced motions as always. They set tables, scrubbed floors, and stitched worn clothes, their bodies functioning on habits rather than strength. By night, they surrendered to the bottle. What looked like calm efficiency during daylight was in truth a hollow routine, sustained by a chemical silence that dulled emotion and stole vitality. Husbands accepted it because meals appeared on the table, and children accepted it because their mothers' voices still guided them through the day. The surface looked stable, but beneath it, these women were withering. The emotional cost was immense. Feelings that once coloured their lives faded into shadows. Joy lost its sharpness, grief lost its tears, and anger lost its voice. A woman who might once have laughed freely or wept openly became muted. Her expressions narrowed to polite smiles and quiet nods. The drug compressed her emotions layer by layer until nothing remained but a faint shell. If one compares this to today, it would be like a person scrolling endlessly through screens, appearing busy and engaged, while in reality retreating deeper into numbness. For the families, this transformation was not always noticed. Children still found food waiting when they came home from work or school. Husbands still had their shirts pressed and their dinners prepared. The tasks were completed, and that was enough. Few thought to ask whether the person performing them felt alive inside. Women themselves learned to measure success not by how they felt, but by what they accomplished, even if each task was carried out in a haze. In this way, Laudanum rewrote the very definition of a good wife obedience. Silence and efficiency mattered more than spirit or vitality. It is painful to reflect on how an entire generation of women lived this way, without those around them recognizing what was being lost. Nighttime brought the deepest surrender. As the family settled, women reached for the bottle not as a choice but as a necessity. Sleep without laudanum became impossible. The body ached, the mind raced, and fear of another restless night drove them to pour the familiar liquid again. Within moments of swallowing it, the tension eased, and they slipped into heavy stillness. Husbands mistook this for peace, never realizing it was the paralysis of dependency. Children tiptoed past their mothers' doors, unaware that inside lay not rest but sedation. The routine became so established that few questioned it. Addiction wore the mask of habit, and habit became indistinguishable from identity. The cycle repeated with quiet relentlessness. By morning, the women awoke heavy and slow, yet still moved through their duties. They smiled weakly when spoken to, laughed lightly when expected, and rarely raised their voices. This subdued state was even praised. Society admired calm, quiet women, interpreting their silence as grace rather than the emptiness of chemical suppression. The irony was bitter. The very qualities that signalled illness were mistaken for virtues. Families congratulated themselves on having wives and mothers so composed. While those women drifted further into dependency, some women recognized their condition but could not break free. They spoke quietly of exhaustion, of the need to continue because there was no alternative. If they reduced their dose, they could not sleep, and if they did not sleep, they could not work. Their families depended on them, and so they continued. Others never acknowledged the truth at all, convincing themselves that the bottle was only a temporary aid, something they could stop at any time. Both groups were equally trapped, and both lived their lives as muted versions of themselves. The household environment reinforced the cycle. Laudanum bottles sat beside sewing kits and jars of flour, blending into the scenery of domestic life. There was no stigma attached, no shame in reaching for the liquid. It was as natural as pouring tea or slicing bread. In this way, addiction thrived unchallenged, hidden in plain sight. The women who relied on it did not look different from those who did not. They wore the same aprons, spoke the same polite phrases, and smiled the same tired smiles. The distinction between health and dependence blurred until it vanished. Over time, the damage grew undeniable. Women grew paler, weaker, and less able to recover from illness. Some collapsed during chores, their bodies too frail to continue. Others withdrew emotionally, no longer responding to the affection of children or the presence of husbands. Yet these changes were often excused as signs of delicate health or feminine fragility, ideas already deeply rooted in the culture. Few connected them to the bottles that had become so ordinary in every home. The silence of women's suffering was compounded by the silence of society. The tragedy of these wives lies in how invisible their decline became. They appeared to fulfill their duties, but their identities eroded. They smiled even as they faded, and their smiles were mistaken for contentment. They raised children, tended homes, and supported husbands, all while losing themselves to a drug prescribed in trust and accepted in ignorance. The image of the devoted wife survived, but the reality was a body and mind subdued by opium. The households continued, but the women at their centres were ghosts, performing roles without life behind them. This stage of the epidemic revealed how laudanum reshaped the family. It preserved appearances while hollowing out the people within. It allowed husbands to believe in stability, children to believe in care, and society to believe in order. But beneath the surface, the cost was devastating. Entire lives passed in a blur of duty and sedation, leaving behind little more than photographs of women who smiled without joy and lived without freedom. Wives carried on their roles with smiles, but their strength was only an illusion sustained by laudanum. The bottle dulled their feelings, yet households praised their quiet efficiency as virtue. What seemed like normal family life was, in truth, a fragile facade built on dependency. For 2 decades, one woman was spoken of in her community as an example of quiet perfection. She never raised her voice, never missed a chore, and never failed to appear calm in public. Neighbours described her as gentle, reliable, and graceful. Her husband proudly introduced her as a model of stability, and her children believed they had the good fortune of a mother who never lost her temper. Behind this image, however, was a habit so deeply rooted that even those closest to her failed to see it. The bottle of laudanum at her bedside became as constant as the lamp on her table, and the nightly dose defined her life more than any act of will. It almost feels cruelly ironic that the very qualities praised in her, patience, composure, obedience, were signs not of virtue but of sedation. Her life was not dramatic, and perhaps that was why suspicion never arose. She moved through her routines with a steady rhythm, preparing meals, overseeing the house, and attending church with her family. Nothing about her behaviour seemed strange, except perhaps its very consistency. She rarely expressed strong feelings, either of joy or grief. When others wept at funerals, she stood quietly. When laughter filled a room, her smile was soft and restrained. People admired her restraint, imagining it to be evidence of moral character. In truth, it was the dulling effect of laudanum, smoothing every edge until little remained. Her children grew up accustomed to her stillness. They never heard arguments in the home, never saw conflict between their parents. They mistook this silence for harmony, unaware that the peace they cherished was born from numbness. She listened to their stories with a faint smile, nodded when they asked questions, and tucked them into bed without fuss. To them, she was reliable, though not particularly warm. The absence of passion was accepted as part of her nature, and so no one imagined that opium shaped every interaction. When her death came, it was sudden but unsurprising. She was middle-aged, with no severe illness, but her body had weakened over the years of nightly doses. The death certificate recorded weakness of the heart, a phrase so vague it could mean almost anything. Families rarely questioned such diagnoses, and hers was no exception. They mourned quietly, proud that she had lived a life without scandal or flaw. If one compares this to our time, it would be like discovering that the colleague admired for tireless calm at work had survived only by swallowing a steady stream of pills, their performance praised while their suffering ignored. The truth came only after her passing. While sorting through her belongings, her children opened drawers and cupboards. Beneath folded clothes and tucked into boxes were empty bottles, one after another, stacked or hidden away. By the time they finished counting, there were more than 200. Each had once contained laudanum, each had once been a nightly escape. The discovery shocked them, not because of the number, but because it revealed that their mother's life had been shaped by addiction all along. Every memory they held of her quiet smile and gentle presence was reframed as the effect of a drug they had never considered. The impact of this revelation lingered. For the children, it was as if they had never known their mother at all. The woman they admired as calm and perfect had never truly been present. Her affection, her patience, her composure, all had been filtered through laudanum. This realization brought grief layered with confusion, because to admit it was to accept that the very foundation of their family's image had been false. What they lost was not only a mother, but also the idea of who she had been. The wider community did not hear this truth. To neighbours, her legacy remained intact. She was remembered as a woman who never caused trouble, who lived and died with dignity. Families spoke of her as an example for their daughters, unaware of what her children had uncovered. The silence around Laudanum preserved her reputation even as it destroyed her reality. The contrast between public praise and private truth illustrates how the epidemic thrived. Appearances mattered more than what lay beneath. This story was not unique. Many women lived and died under similar conditions, their addictions hidden behind reputations for obedience and grace. Families preferred not to question, and society preferred to celebrate what it called virtue. Bottles of laudanum accumulated in secret, tucked away until death revealed them. Even then, the discoveries were often kept private because shame silenced truth. The result was a cycle where countless lives ended with the same quiet phrase, weakness of the heart, while the real cause remained unspoken. The tragedy of this woman's life reflects the broader tragedy of her time. She embodied the ideal of Victorian femininity, quiet, modest, and uncomplaining. Yet that ideal was sustained by dependency on a drug that eroded her health and hollowed her presence. Families admired the very qualities that destroyed her, and society rewarded what was, in truth, slow self-destruction. I find it deeply unsettling that what was most praised in her life was the very evidence of her decline. What remains of her story are the empty bottles. They tell a truth her family could not speak, a truth her neighbours never guessed. They reveal how laudanum shaped not only her life, but the lives of her children, who grew up believing in an illusion. For every bottle discarded, another day of her life was spent in sedation. The neat rows of glass were not only remnants of addiction, but also a ledger of years lost to chemical calm. Her story underscores how the epidemic hid itself. The surface of her life looked so respectable that no one thought to ask deeper questions. The authority of doctors, the silence of families, and the obsession with appearances combined to create a world where even 200 bottles could remain unnoticed until after death. It is a reminder of how easily societies can mistake silence for virtue and destruction for discipline. She lived quietly, praised as an example of perfection, but her calm was only the mask of laudanum. Her death revealed the hidden bottles, proof that her life had never been as it seemed. And while her family reeled from the discovery, other households continued their routines, never suspecting that similar secrets lay beneath their own flaws. Daughters in Victorian households grew up surrounded by routines that seemed ordinary. Among the most common was the preparation of laudanum for their mothers. By the age of 9, many girls already knew how to measure the drops into a glass, stirring them carefully before handing the liquid over. The smell of laudanum was not strange to them. It blended into the air of their homes as naturally as the smell of bread or soap. To a child, what was familiar was what was safe. And so the scent of opium became a companion of daily life. It is grimly ironic that children learned responsibility by preparing poison for the very people they depended on most. This early exposure shaped how daughters understood care. They believed helping their mothers meant filling bottles, wiping rims, and handing over glasses of the syrup. The task carried a sense of pride, because it proved they were useful and trusted. They watched mothers drink without hesitation, saw fathers accept it as routine, and heard neighbours speak of laudanum with respect. No one told them this was dangerous. There were no warnings carved into their memories. The cycle began quietly, hidden behind the idea of family duty. Over time, the children began to associate the drug with comfort. When mothers grew restless or weak, a small measure of laudanum seemed to restore calm. The daughters saw it as a solution, not a threat. In their minds, the act of pouring from the bottle was as natural as serving tea. They absorbed not only the smell and taste, but the entire ritual. Later, when they faced their own sleepless nights or aching bodies, they repeated the same motions they had once performed for their mothers. If we look at this with today's eyes, it is like a child growing up watching energy drinks consumed as if they were medicine. then turning to them as adults without ever questioning the health risks. Generations repeated the same behaviours. Mothers passed on their habits without words, daughters copied them without thought, and granddaughters inherited the same bottles years later. Families did not recognise this as a chain of dependency, only as tradition. Each generation grew up in homes where laudanum bottles were part of the furniture, placed on shelves and dressers like any other household item. This normality was the most powerful teacher of all. Children learned addiction not through rebellion but through obedience. The impact on daughters was subtle but lasting. They came to believe that health meant sedation, that quietness meant wellness, and that calm meant strength. When they began to feel discomfort, they reached instinctively for the bottle. Their mothers had modelled it, their families had accepted it, and society had encouraged it. By the time they realised they needed laudanum nightly, it was too late. What began as an act of care for their mothers became an act of survival for themselves. I cannot shake the unease of imagining little girls learning tenderness by measuring drops of opium instead of holding their mother's hand. This cycle was strengthened by silence. Families rarely spoke openly about dependence, and so daughters were left without context. They saw symptoms but did not connect them to laudanum. They noticed weakness, fainting, or long hours of sleep, but assumed these were natural conditions of womanhood. The lack of explanation ensured that they repeated the same mistakes. By the time questions arose, they were already dependent, and the habit was too entrenched to escape easily. The normalisation of laudanum within homes also concealed its true cost. Empty bottles were discarded quietly, hidden in cupboards or beneath beds. Children helped tidy them away, unaware that each represented another step deeper into addiction. The secrecy reinforced the idea that this was something not to be questioned, only to be accepted. Silence and repetition bound the generations together, leaving little room for doubt or resistance. Doctors played a role in this inheritance as well. When daughters grew old enough to be patients themselves, they received the same prescriptions as their mothers. The cycle gained authority through medical approval. What began as an imitation was confirmed as a legitimate treatment. Families rarely considered stopping the habit when it was endorsed by those they trusted most. Thus, the circle tightened, binding generations of women to the same quiet decline. For the daughters, the cost was not only physical but emotional. They carried memories of their mother's weakness, yet believed those memories proved the necessity of laudanum. They repeated patterns that had caused them pain, convinced they were protecting themselves. In truth, they were reliving their mother's decline. The inheritance they received was not wealth or wisdom, but dependency, passed down like an heirloom no one wanted, yet no one dared discard. Over the decades, the repetition of this cycle became invisible to society. Families buried mothers, daughters took their places, and new girls grew up to do the same. The continuity was so smooth that few noticed the tragedy. Communities saw families that looked stable, women who looked composed, and children who looked dutiful. What they did not see was the shared shadow cast over all of them, a shadow created by bottles of laudanum passed from hand to hand. The persistence of this cycle reveals how addiction thrives not only in individuals but in families and cultures. It is sustained not just by desire but by habit, by rituals performed without thought, by examples repeated without question. The daughters who learned dependency from their mothers did not choose it. They inherited it like the air in their homes, breathing it in until it became part of who they were. The cruel truth is that a mother's love, expressed through daily rituals, could quietly teach her children to repeat her own destruction. Girls began by helping their mothers, unaware that each bottle they touched prepared them for their own future dependence. The cycle of care turned into a cycle of addiction, passed silently from one generation to the next, and while families believed they were nurturing strength, they were in fact raising daughters who would walk the same path. The so-called rest homes of Victorian London were advertised as havens for women in need of recovery. Families sent wives and daughters there with the belief that they would return stronger, calmer, and more balanced. The buildings themselves often looked respectable, with clean facades, tall windows, and well-kept gardens. Yet inside, the reality was starkly different. Women were placed in narrow beds lined up in rows, watched over by attendants who measured out morphine each morning as if it were breakfast. There was no therapy, no true care, only injections that dulled the body and silenced the mind. It is bitterly absurd that places called sanctuaries operated more like holding pens for those society wished to forget. The women entered these institutions for reasons that varied but often had little to do with real illness. Some were judged too emotional, others too resistant, and many were simply considered inconvenient to their husbands. Doctors recommended stays as a cure for nervous conditions or hysteria, but what these recommendations achieved was separation. Once inside, the women's identities began to dissolve. They were no longer mothers, wives, or daughters in any meaningful sense. They became patients, marked by their silence and their compliance, shaped not by healing but by sedation. Looking at this now, it would be like modern clinics giving powerful tranquilizers to every woman who voiced dissatisfaction in her marriage, claiming it was treatment rather than dismissal. The daily routine reinforced this transformation. At dawn, nurses moved from bed to bed with vials and syringes. Each woman received her dose, often without question, and within minutes the ward settled into a heavy quiet. The morphine dulled pain but also erased will. Women lay still for hours, eyes half open, bodies slack, voices hushed to whispers or lost altogether. Meals were given at fixed times, tasteless and repetitive, and consumed mechanically. Conversations dwindled, and soon silence became the language of the place. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, until many women no longer knew how long they had been inside. For the families who visited, the sight of calm bodies was reassuring. They believed their wives or daughters were improving because they no longer cried or complained. The absence of distress was mistaken for recovery. Husbands felt justified in their decisions. Children were told their mothers were resting, and doctors congratulated themselves on successful treatment. In truth, the women were not healing, but fading. Their quietness was not peace, but paralysis. I cannot help but feel that these institutions served men more than women, providing relief not from illness, but from the burden of listening. The environment itself reinforced the illusion of order. Halls were scrubbed, sheets kept white, and attendants wore uniforms that suggested professionalism. The outward signs of cleanliness disguised the inward decay. Behind the polished surface, women's health declined. Muscles weakened from disuse, minds clouded from constant sedation, and spirits dimmed from neglect. Yet none of this was recorded as failure. Reports described the patients as stable, their conditions managed, their lives extended by medical care. What was left unsaid was that these lives had been stripped of vitality. The lack of conversation or listening was perhaps the cruelest part. Women were not encouraged to speak of their feelings or experiences. Questions were brushed aside, complaints dismissed as symptoms of their condition. Their voices faded not because they had nothing to say, but because no one heard them. Silence became both enforced and internalized. Over time, many women stopped trying altogether, retreating into the heavy fog that the morphine produced. They were alive in body but absent in spirit, reduced to shadows of themselves. This silence also protected the institutions from criticism. As long as women remained quiet, their suffering could be hidden. Families rarely challenged the practices because they trusted the authority of doctors and valued the appearance of stability over the reality of care. When women returned home, they often brought the dependency with them, still in need of morphine to function. If they never returned at all, their absence was explained away as the natural outcome of illness. The cycle continued because no one demanded answers. These homes reveal much about Victorian attitudes toward women's health. illness was not understood as a complex experience, but as a problem to be managed through control. Sedation provided the simplest solution. Instead of addressing the causes of distress, poverty, isolation, and limited rights, society numbed the symptoms. It was easier to quiet women than to change the structures that oppressed them. In this sense, the rest homes were not places of healing, but instruments of conformity, ensuring that women remained silent and compliant. The tragedy is that many of the women admitted were not gravely ill. They entered with anxieties, sleeplessness, or unhappiness that might have been eased with support or understanding. What they received instead was chemical sedation that deepened their despair. Some never regained the ability to live fully, their minds permanently clouded. Others died within the institutions, their deaths recorded as natural, their dependency never acknowledged. The rest homes did not save lives. They consumed them quietly, leaving behind only the impression of order. In the end, these institutions stand as monuments to neglect disguised as care. Their patients were not given comfort but silence, not strength but weakness, not recovery but retreat. They became ghosts while still alive, their identities dissolved under the weight of daily injections and unspoken suffering. The houses stood proudly on city streets, admired for their appearance, yet within their walls, countless women lost themselves, unseen and unheard. The rest homes that promised recovery instead delivered sedation, turning women into shadows of their former selves. Their silence was misread as stability, and their suffering was hidden behind clean walls and white sheets. As more women entered these places, the line between treatment and abandonment grew harder to see. Dinner tables in the wealthier homes of Victorian London were meant to display order and comfort. The food was carefully arranged, the silver polished, and the children seated in quiet rows. Yet among the dishes of steamed fish and mashed potatoes, another object often shared space with the bread and wine, a bottle of laudanum. It sat near the mother's place, not hidden in a cabinet or kept in a drawer, but openly present, as natural to the meal as salt or vinegar. To the family, its presence seemed unremarkable. They had grown used to it, and so the sight of the bottle drew no attention. It is almost absurd that poison could sit beside dinner plates and still be mistaken for an ordinary condiment. The mother herself often appeared distant. Her eyes blinked more slowly than the rest of the family, and her sentences trailed off midway. When she tried to speak, her words sometimes faltered, broken into fragments that no one remarked upon. The children watched without understanding, accustomed to their mother's quietness. The father carried on with his meal, speaking sparingly, while the household staff moved through their duties as if nothing were unusual. The entire table existed in a silence that felt normal, yet was born of sedation. For the children, this silence had lasting effects. They rarely looked directly into their mother's eyes, for she was often unable to return their gaze. Instead, her focus slipped downward, her mind dulled by the double doses she took when fatigue grew too heavy. The distance between parent and child widened in these quiet moments, though no one named it. The mother still sat at the head of the table, still performed her role, yet her presence was ghost-like. If we imagine this today, it would be like a parent scrolling endlessly on a glowing screen at the dinner table, too distracted to meet the eyes of their children, yet convinced they were still participating in family life. The father's role reinforced the illusion of order. He rarely questioned his wife's reliance on laudanum, perhaps grateful for the calm it produced. No arguments disrupted the evening meal, no complaints interrupted his routines. He accepted the quiet as harmony, not realizing that it came at the cost of connection. The children learned that dinner was not a time for conversation, but a ritual of stillness. Food was consumed, plates were cleared, and the family dispersed, each retreating to their own corners of the house. What should have been a place of warmth became a stage for absence. The household staff, too, contributed to the silence. They carried dishes to and from the table, aware of the bottle but never speaking of it. Servants were expected to ignore what did not concern them, and so they treated the laudanum as part of the family's belongings, like a candlestick or a vase. In this way, the secret was protected not by concealment but by indifference. Everyone saw, but no one looked closely. Everyone knew, but no one acknowledged. The mother's double doses deepened the divide. On some nights, she leaned heavily against the back of her chair, her hands slack in her lap. The children glanced at her nervously but said nothing. They had been raised in an environment where questions were discouraged, where obedience mattered more than curiosity. So they accepted her absence as part of life, even as they longed for the attention she could no longer give. Their understanding of motherhood was shaped by sedation, and their memories of family dinners were filled not with laughter, but with silence. This silence had consequences that stretched far beyond the table. Children who never learned to speak freely at home carried their quietness into adulthood. They became cautious with words, hesitant with feelings, and uncertain in relationships. The inability to look into their mother's eyes became symbolic of a larger absence, the absence of intimacy, of care that went beyond physical presence. They were raised in homes that looked proper, with meals served on time and appearances maintained. But the emotional core was missing. For the mother, the evening ritual reinforced her dependency. Taking laudanum before or during dinner became a habit, and soon she required it not only for sleep but for the endurance of daily life. The bottle at the table symbolized her surrender to the drug, yet it was seen by everyone as ordinary. Her decline unfolded in the most visible space of the home, and still, it remained invisible. I find it deeply disturbing to think of how many children grew up in households where their mothers were present in body but absent in spirit, and no one spoke of it. The culture of silence within these families mirrored the silence of the larger society. Newspapers occasionally carried stories of suspicious deaths, but in most homes, no one connected the dots. Dinner tables across the city looked the same, tidy, quiet, and lifeless. The presence of laudanum bottles was replicated in household after household, yet each family believed their situation was unique, or worse, not worth noticing. Addiction spread under the cover of respectability, reinforced by the rituals of daily life. The tragedy of the dinner table lies in its symbolism. It was supposed to be the heart of the family, the place where bonds were strengthened and lives were shared. Instead, it became a stage for absence, where mothers drifted further from their children and fathers mistook sedation for order. The meals were eaten, but nothing was truly shared. What remained afterward was a hollow memory of food and silence, preserved in the minds of children who grew up believing that this was what family life meant. Over the years, the pattern continued until the mother's health declined beyond repair. Her body weakened, her eyes grew dimmer, and her voice fainter. The family carried on, adjusting quietly to her fading presence, never speaking of what they all saw. When death finally came, it was recorded as another vague illness. The bottle disappeared from the table, but the silence it had created lingered long after. At dinner tables, mother sat surrounded by family, yet their presence was dulled by laudanum. The silence that followed was mistaken for peace, though it left children starved for connection. And as the bottles kept appearing beside meals, the meaning of family life itself began to wither. In one quiet London home, a young mother sat with her infant on her lap. The child was nursing, small hands pressed against her gown, while she leaned back in her chair. On the table beside her stood the familiar bottle of laudanum, its cork already loosened. She had taken more than usual that day, exhausted by sleepless nights and the endless demands of care. Within minutes, her eyelids grew heavy. The warmth of the child against her faded into a blur, and her body slumped into stillness. The baby slid from her lap, falling to the floor with a soft cry no one heard. It is almost unbearably cruel that the very drug trusted to help mothers rest left their children without the safety of their arms. Hours passed in silence. The house remained calm, the servants moving quietly through their tasks, the father away on business. No one entered the room until morning. By then, the mother stirred at last, groggy and confused, her arms empty. She looked around in panic, only to find her child nearby, its tiny cries long since faded. The milk-stained cloth she'd used earlier was stiff with dried blood. She tried to gather herself, but the truth was undeniable. She had slept through the night, not because her body needed rest, but because laudanum had held her in its grip. The family did not speak openly of the event. To them, it was easier to call it an accident, a misfortune that could happen to anyone. Neighbours whispered quietly but did not confront. The father told himself that such tragedies were part of life, that infants were fragile and easily lost. No one wished to connect the death to the bottle on the table, for that would mean acknowledging complicity. If we think of it now, it is like discovering that a child's safety seat was knowingly built with broken straps. Yet families insisted the fault lay with fate rather than the design. For the mother, the guilt was consuming. She had trusted laudanum because it was recommended, because everyone around her accepted it. She had believed it made her a better mother, calmer and less burdened. Yet in that moment, it had betrayed her. The tragedy was not only the child's death, but the realization that she had been deceived into creating the danger herself. She continued to use the drug afterward, for the dependency was already formed, but the shadow of that night remained in her mind. Each dose carried not only numbness but also the memory of what it had cost. Society did not offer comfort to women in her position. Instead, it preserved silence. Families avoided scandal by erasing the truth from records. Death certificates were vague, citing weakness or sudden illness. Doctors continued prescribing as before, unwilling to accept fault. Women bore the blame privately, internalizing their grief until it blended with their dependence. In this way, each personal tragedy was transformed into an isolated accident, never linked to the wider epidemic. The cycle of denial ensured its continuation. The deeper cruelty was how common such cases became. Infants were fragile, and their deaths could be explained away with ease. Few questioned why so many mothers fell asleep unnaturally, or why so many infants failed to thrive. The answer sat plainly on bedside tables and dining room shelves, yet it remained unnamed. Families buried their children, returned home, and placed the laudanum bottle back in its usual place. Life went on, draped in silence. For the children who survived, the consequences were no less profound. They grew up in homes where laudanum shaped daily rhythms, where mothers drifted in and out of consciousness, and where care was fragmented by sedation. These children learned early that presence did not always mean attention, that love could coexist with absence. They carried those lessons into adulthood, shaping how they understood family and trust. What began with a mother's bottle spread invisibly into the lives of all around her. The tragedy also exposed the limits of Victorian ideals. Society celebrated motherhood as sacred, the highest duty of a woman, yet it simultaneously promoted a drug that undermined that very role. Mothers were praised for devotion, but given laudanum when their devotion exhausted them. The contradiction was glaring, yet it persisted. To question it would have been to question the structures of family and medicine themselves, and few were willing to take that risk. I cannot help but think how bitter it is that women were expected to embody perfect motherhood while being quietly handed the very substance that destroyed their ability to protect their children. The image of a mother falling asleep while nursing her child is one of the most haunting symbols of the epidemic. It captures the intimacy of care and the devastation of its loss. It shows how trust in authority, obedience to custom, and ignorance of danger combine to create preventable tragedies. It also reveals how silence allowed those tragedies to multiply. Each family believed their suffering was unique, when in reality it was shared across countless households. In the end, these stories are not just about individual misfortunes, but about a society that allowed them to happen repeatedly. The mother who awoke to find her child gone was not an isolated figure. She was part of a pattern, one that spanned neighbourhoods and generations. The bottles that lined shop shelves and bedside tables were instruments of grief as much as of calm. The tragedy of her story lies not only in what was lost, but in how it was accepted as ordinary. A mother fell asleep while nursing, and the silence of the household allowed the tragedy to pass unnoticed. Her grief was buried beneath routine, her loss treated as fate rather than consequence. Yet as more bottles appeared in homes, more children faced the same silent danger. In the private corners of Victorian homes, signs of laudanum addiction were often subtle, hidden in habits that outsiders rarely noticed. Yet for some women, the evidence was carved directly into their bodies. Their wrists bore calluses, small hardened patches of skin formed by years of holding the same glass bottles day after day. These marks were not from labour in fields or factories, but from the repeated grip of addiction. A bottle weighed little, but the endless repetition of lifting, pouring, and pressing it to the lips left its imprint all the same. It is grimly ironic that society admired women's soft, delicate hands, while many of them were scarred by the tools of their own undoing. The tremors that came with dependency deepened the problem. As the drug took hold, women found their hands no longer steady. The glass slipped, fell, and shattered more than once. To avoid the waste and the shame of broken bottles, some tied cords around their wrists, fastening them to the containers. The sight of a woman drinking with a bottle bound to her hand might have seemed strange to an outsider, yet within the walls of these homes, it became ordinary. The binding was not discussed, nor was it hidden. It was simply accepted as part of daily life, another adjustment to the quiet reality of dependence. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like strapping a phone to one's hand because putting it down even briefly felt impossible, the object becoming an extension of the body itself. The frequency of use was staggering. Many women consumed laudanum more often than they ate meals. The bottle was raised to their lips at morning, at noon, and again before bed. Some poured measures into tea, disguising the act even from themselves, while others drank openly. Their families saw but did not count. They assumed that if the doctors prescribed it, the habit could not be dangerous. So the women continued, each swallow deepening the hold, each callus on the wrist hardening as proof of their devotion to the drug. I find it chilling to imagine entire households watching these routines without question, as if the ritual itself were no more unusual than saying grace before supper. These physical signs were rarely acknowledged, even by those who noticed them. Husbands and children saw the hardened patches of skin but dismissed them as minor details. Servants observed the cords tied around bottles but remained silent, trained not to speak of what belonged to their employers. Doctors sometimes glimpsed the marks but interpreted them as trivial, never connecting them to the broader picture of dependency. Silence preserved appearances, and appearances preserved the epidemic. The consequences went far beyond the wrist. The constant doses weakened women's stomachs, dulled their eyes, and left their voices faint. Yet the calluses remained perhaps the most visible reminder of how far they had travelled down the path of addiction. Unlike inner suffering, the hardened skin could not be hidden behind polite smiles or careful clothing. It was there, undeniable, even if no one admitted its meaning. In photographs, carefully posed and dressed, those wrists were concealed by gloves, but within the home they told the story plainly. These marks also represented time. Each callus was built over years, each groove deepened by thousands of repetitions. They were evidence not only of dependency, but of the endless passage of days spent under laudanum's influence. For a woman to bear such marks meant she had lived long enough with the drug for it to become her defining routine. It was not a brief cure, not a temporary aid, but a way of life that stretched across decades. The skin itself became a record of survival and decline. Family members who relied on their mothers for stability learned to overlook these signs. Children still received meals and instructions, even if the hands that delivered them shook. Husbands still found the household in order, even if the order came at the cost of sedation. In this way, the marks on the wrist became invisible, not because they were unseen, but because no one wanted to acknowledge what they revealed. The calluses were easier to ignore than the truth they pointed to. The tragedy of these women lay in how their suffering was hidden in plain sight. The wrist that bore the marks of endless use also stirred soup, mended clothes, and combed hair. The cord tied around the bottle allowed them to keep performing their roles, prolonging the illusion of normal life. Yet beneath that illusion was a reality of exhaustion, of bodies breaking down under constant exposure to opium. The marks were not symbols of strength but of survival in conditions no one should have endured. Over time, the calluses hardened even as the women weakened. Their skin adapted, but their bodies did not. Their families continued to accept the routines, believing that what was common must be harmless. The truth, however, was that every hardened wrist carried the story of a woman who had been consumed slowly. Her life measured not in years but in doses. The marks that should have been recognized as warnings became instead part of the quiet scenery of domestic life. In the end, these physical signs remind us that addiction was not always hidden beneath layers of secrecy. Sometimes it was etched directly onto the body, visible to anyone who cared to see. The wrists of addicted mothers were not only instruments of their daily duties, but also records of their dependence. They carried the weight of bottles, of silence, and of years lost to laudanum. And they tell us now, more clearly than any words of the time, how deeply the epidemic shaped lives. Mothers bore calluses on their wrists, silent evidence of the bottles they lifted countless times each day. Their families overlooked the signs, mistaking routine for safety, even as dependency deepened. What remained were bodies that carried the truth openly, though no one dared to name it. At the grand parties of Victorian London, the glitter of chandeliers and the scent of perfume filled the air. Silk gowns swept across polished floors, orchestras played, and fireworks lit the night sky. Guests raised glasses, toasted fortunes, and admired the spectacle. Yet beneath the shimmering surface, many women carried a secret tucked inside their routines. Before stepping into carriages or greeting hosts, they had swallowed small morphine tablets. These pills promised not relief from pain, but the ability to appear lively, to laugh at the right moments, and to glide through the evening without the weight of fatigue or sorrow. It is almost laughable that society praised these women for elegance when much of their poise came not from spirit but from sedation. The allure of these gatherings was powerful. High society demanded presence and performance. Women were expected to smile, converse, and charm, even when burdened by exhaustion or despair. Morphine offered an easy solution. A dose taken discreetly at home, or even in a quiet corner of the ballroom, gave the illusion of energy. They felt lighter, their steps surer, their words smoother. To observers, they seemed radiant. To themselves, they felt strangely distant, as if watching their lives from behind a veil. If we imagine this in today's world, it would be like guests at a glittering gala quietly taking tranquilizers before stepping on stage, praised for confidence while hiding chemical dependence. The parties became stages where appearances mattered more than reality. Women glided across the floor with practiced grace, their gowns shimmering as they laughed at jokes they barely heard. The morphine softened the edges of discomfort, but it also hollowed them out. Their laughter rang out, but it lacked warmth. Their eyes sparkled under candlelight, but the sparkle came from the drug, not from joy. Husbands and peers congratulated them on their composure, never realizing that the charm was chemically sustained. The pressure to appear flawless left no room for authenticity. Behind the scenes, the reliance grew deeper. A woman who once took a tablet to endure one evening found herself needing it for the next, and then for every event. Soon, The gatherings themselves became inseparable from the drug. The bottle or packet of pills was as essential as gloves or jewellery. Without it, anxiety crept in, and the thought of facing the crowd seemed unbearable. Dependence intertwined with social expectation, until the two were indistinguishable. The ballroom was not simply a place of music and light, it was a theatre of quiet addiction. The irony was sharp. Society praised these women for refinement, for self-control, and for their ability to embody grace under pressure. Yet their calmness was not self-control but suppression. Their beauty was not untouched but altered by chemicals. The very qualities admired by peers were sustained by substances that weakened their health and drained their vitality. I cannot help but feel unsettled by how an entire culture applauded illusions, never asking what it cost the women who lived them. The physical toll of morphine was hidden beneath layers of silk and lace. Women's bodies grew thinner, their complexions paler, yet the gowns concealed much of it. Powder covered blemishes, rouge masked fatigue, and the glow of candlelight softened their appearance. In the dim shimmer of a ballroom, the damage was invisible. Only in private moments did the weakness show, when hands trembled as they unclasped jewellery, when legs faltered climbing stairs, when silence replaced conversation once the drug's effect wore off. These truths remained hidden, tucked away until morning. The cycle fed itself through silence. Servants who prepared their ladies for the evening often knew of the pills but said nothing. Husbands benefited from wives who looked serene and graceful, and so they asked no questions. Friends, who shared the same habits, reassured one another by their mutual secrecy. No one wished to admit that the laughter and elegance of the night were hollow. To admit it would be to shatter the illusion that made society itself feel grand. The quiet pact of denial allowed the epidemic to flourish even in the most glittering spaces. For many women, the ballroom was both escape and prison. The lights, music, and company offered a distraction from isolation at home, yet the price was reliance on morphine to endure it. The drug dulled anxieties but also dulled connection. Conversations became superficial, gestures automatic, and emotions blunted. They drifted through the evening as if floating, their feet moving but their minds detached. The dance was graceful, but it was empty of meaning. Over time, dependence crept into other parts of life. What began as a dose before parties became a dose before visits, then a dose before daily duties. The tablets that once seemed like accessories for special occasions became necessary for survival. Women who once used morphine to avoid appearing tired at a ball found themselves unable to cook, sew, or even rise from bed without it. The ballroom was only one stage of many where the drug held control. The tragedy of these gatherings lies in how completely they disguised suffering. Outsiders saw beauty, laughter, and harmony. Inside, women felt emptiness, distance, and decline. The morphine made them appear lively, but it robbed them of genuine life. The gowns, jewels, and music created an image of splendour, but the reality was hollow. High society, so eager to present itself as refined, had built its elegance on the foundations of silence and sedation. In the end, the image of women smiling beneath chandeliers while numbed by morphine captures the contradictions of the age. It shows how appearances were valued above truth, how dependence was mistaken for refinement, and how suffering could be hidden beneath silk. These women were praised as ornaments of their society, yet they lived as prisoners of the very drug that gave them their glow. In the brilliance of parties, women appeared radiant, yet their grace was sustained by morphine hidden beneath silk. The laughter and elegance masked emptiness, and the ballroom became both escape and prison. As the nights multiplied, so too did the silent cost of keeping appearances alive. The exchange of gifts among Victorian women often carried layers of meaning. Jewellery, lace, or perfumes symbolised affection, loyalty, and refinement. Yet hidden within this culture of giving was another kind of present, one that looked harmless but carried devastating consequences. Small vials of morphine were passed discreetly between friends, offered as tokens of trust or gestures of intimacy. They were wrapped in the language of elegance, presented not as medicine, but as treasures. To receive such a gift was to be included in a circle of sophistication, a reminder that one belonged to the refined world of salons and drawing rooms. It is unsettlingly ironic that a drug capable of erasing entire lives was once exchanged with the same cheer as ribbons and chocolates. Morphine was dressed in the aura of wealth and modernity. Its packaging echoed luxury goods, polished bottles, elegant labels, and ornate boxes that fit neatly beside cosmetics. The substance itself had been elevated by doctors and advertisements alike, praised as a miracle of science. Women who gave it as gifts believed they were sharing comfort, a kind of secret knowledge about how to survive the pressures of their world. In a society where appearances mattered more than realities, morphine carried prestige. If we compare this to today, it would be like offering a branded box of sedatives at a dinner party, praised as chic rather than recognized as destructive. Friendship circles became conduits for the epidemic. Within the salons of London, women gathered to discuss fashion, literature, and family. Conversations flowed easily, accompanied by tea and confections. Beneath the lace gloves and polished manners, a quiet ritual took place. One woman would lean close, open a small case, and press a vial into her friend's hand. There was no sense of danger, no hesitation. The gift was received with a smile, as if it were perfume or powder. The act bound them together, reinforcing their intimacy. Dependency was not spoken of. Instead, the gesture was cloaked in the language of luxury and care. The gifts spread quickly because they fit into existing customs. Women were expected to exchange tokens of appreciation. Embroidery, ribbons, or soaps were common, but morphine added an edge of modernity and exclusivity. To be given such a gift suggested one was trusted with something valuable, a secret of refinement. Recipients rarely questioned its safety. They assumed that if their friend offered it, it must be respectable. The intimacy of the exchange masked the danger, and the epidemic spread not through confrontation, but through affection. The pressure to accept was immense. Declining such a gift risked offending a friend or appearing ungrateful. Women were already judged for their conformity to social expectations. To resist a gesture that others embraced could mark one as prudish or strange. Many accepted without hesitation, swallowing the pills or sipping the vials during gatherings. The ritual became woven into the fabric of social life, as common as sipping tea or nibbling biscuits. The danger was never named, and silence preserved the illusion of safety. I cannot help but feel chilled by the thought that friendship itself, which should have been a shield, became one of the most efficient tools for spreading addiction. Behind the polished doors of salons, these exchanges shaped a hidden network. Addiction travelled across neighbourhoods through friendships, each gift a step deeper into dependency. Women who might never have approached a chemist or asked a doctor for morphine found themselves drawn into its grasp by trusted companions. The drug's reach expanded not by force but by kindness, its power amplified by the very relationships that gave women strength. It was this subtlety that made the epidemic so enduring. What began as a gesture of affection ended as a chain of dependence. The culture of gifting morphine also reflected the broader contradictions of the age. Victorian society celebrated female virtue, restraint, and morality. Yet beneath this facade, women were exchanging poison under the guise of luxury. It revealed a world obsessed with appearances, where danger could be disguised as refinement, and where silence was valued more than truth. These contradictions were not hidden accidents. They were central to the way the epidemic thrived. Women learned to smile as they offered destruction, and to smile again as they accepted it. For many, the first doses taken in friendship gatherings marked the beginning of lifelong reliance. They started with occasional use, perhaps during evenings when anxiety ran high, or when fatigue set in after long days. Over time, the doses grew more frequent. Women found they needed the drug not only in salons but in their homes, before sleep, or even in the middle of the day. The bottle that began as a gift became a constant companion, sitting on dressers and bedside tables. The intimacy of friendship had planted seeds of dependency that grew into forests of silence. These habits spread beyond the salons themselves. Guests who left gatherings carried the gifts with them, introducing them into new households. One woman's dependence could ripple outward through her circle of friends, then into their families, until entire communities were shaped by the same quiet reliance. This was how the epidemic expanded without open confrontation. It did not require force or deception by strangers. It grew through trust, through bonds, through the very gestures meant to strengthen community. The tragedy of these exchanges is how invisible they remained. No one thought to record them, to document how many women first tasted morphine in the comfort of a friend's parlour. Doctors did not ask, families did not know, and history nearly forgot. Yet the impact was profound. Women who once met for laughter and gossip found themselves bound together not only by friendship but by addiction. What they thought was elegance turned into erosion. What they believed was luxury turned into loss. By the time some recognized the danger, it was too late. The friendships that had nurtured them also delivered the chains they could not break. Attempts to stop often meant confessing to friends who were themselves addicted, and so silence prevailed. The epidemic hid within bonds of loyalty, sustained by gestures too ordinary to be questioned. It was not a scandal but routine that kept the bottles moving, one hand to another, salon to salon. In the end, the practice of gifting morphine shows how cultural rituals can become instruments of destruction. What appeared as affection masked dependency, and what seemed like generosity spread quiet suffering. The epidemic moved with ease because it dressed itself in refinement and was carried forward by trust. It reminds us that sometimes danger does not arrive from strangers but from the hands of those dearest to us. Elegant vials of morphine passed between women as tokens of friendship, spreading dependency disguised as luxury. The silence of salons preserved the illusion of safety. Even as lives were quietly reshaped, each gift bound friends together, but it also bound them to a future of hollow dependence. A girl of 13 sat quietly in her home, her body small within the heavy furniture of a Victorian parlour. Her mother had already decided that her restlessness was a sign of hysteria, a word used casually at the time to describe any behaviour that seemed troubling in young women. The prescription was simple laudanum or morphine, administered as a precaution. At first, the girl resisted, uncertain of the bitter liquid placed in her hand, but under the steady insistence of her mother, she swallowed it, told that it would soothe her nerves and help her sleep. It is cruelly ironic that a treatment meant to protect a child from imagined illness instead delivered her into real dependency. The situation grew more complicated when the girl discovered how her mother's attention changed with illness. Complaints of stomach pain brought tenderness, soft words, and time spent together, longing for affection. She began to exaggerate her discomfort. Soon, she no longer needed to pretend. The laudanum created real symptoms, drowsiness, weakness, and a reliance that left her unable to function without it. What had begun as an act of seeking love turned into the foundation of addiction. To see this from a modern perspective, it would be like a child faking headaches for comfort, only to be given strong sedatives that quickly became impossible to live without. Within months, the drug had reshaped her life. Sleep without it was impossible. Nights once filled with restlessness became nights filled with fear of being without the bottle. Each evening brought a new dose, and each morning began with the fog of dependence. Her schoolwork faltered, her friendships suffered, and her once lively spirit dulled. The drug was supposed to cure weakness, but it created fragility far greater than anything her mother had imagined. The home became both her shelter and her prison, every room shadowed by the presence of the bottle. The mother believed she was doing the right thing. Guided by doctors who prescribed laudanum for nearly every complaint, she trusted the medicine. To her, the drug was not poison but progress, a tool of science that allowed her to control her daughter's health. When the girl asked for more, the mother saw it as confirmation that the medicine was needed. She did not recognize the early signs of dependence. Instead, she praised her daughter for taking her treatment responsibly. The cycle of trust and error grew stronger, each side reinforcing the other. The tragedy was sharpened by silence. The girl could not confess the truth of her growing reliance, for she feared losing her mother's affection. The mother could not question the doctors, for she feared being seen as ignorant or ungrateful. Together, they lived within an illusion, both convinced that the medicine was protecting the child. Neighbours saw nothing unusual, for many families lived the same way. The epidemic did not spread through secrecy alone, but through its very normality. I find it deeply unsettling that a child's need for love could be transformed so easily into a lifelong dependency through the authority of medicine and the expectations of family. As the months turned into years, the girl's body adapted to the constant presence of laudanum. What once made her sleepy now barely dulled her nerves. The doses increased, the reliance deepened, and her future narrowed. By adolescence, she was already marked by the signs of addiction: pale skin, darkened eyes, and trembling hands. Her family still believed she was delicate, perhaps too refined for ordinary life, unaware that the refinement they admired was the result of chemical sedation. The identity of a frail Victorian girl became indistinguishable from the reality of a dependent one. The broader society encouraged this illusion. Advertisements claimed laudanum was gentle, safe for women and children alike. Doctors defended its use, pointing to its ability to calm the restless and ease the sleepless. Families who relied on it were seen as modern, embracing science rather than clinging to old remedies. The girl's situation was not unusual but typical. She was one of thousands whose lives were shaped by the unquestioned trust in a drug that eroded health while preserving appearances. The cost of this trust was immense. As she grew older, the girl found herself unable to imagine life without laudanum. It was no longer about pleasing her mother or easing her discomfort. It was about survival. Her body demanded it, her mind feared its absence, and her future revolved around its presence. What had begun as a child's small act of deception had spiraled into a trap she could not escape. The search for affection had delivered her into dependency, and the love she had sought now tied her to the very drug that consumed her. In time, even her mother began to see the changes. The girl's laughter was rare, her steps unsteady, her days marked by fatigue. Yet by then, the dependency was too entrenched to reverse. Doctors offered no alternatives, and society offered no support. The girl became another figure in the long line of women whose lives were quietly eroded by laudanum, her story blending into the larger silence of the epidemic. Her fate was not a scandal, not a warning, but another example of how easily innocence could be consumed. The image of a child growing into addiction under the watchful eyes of her family captures the cruelty of the age. It reveals how trust in medicine, desire for affection, and ignorance of danger combined to destroy lives before they had even begun. The girl's story was not unique, but it was emblematic. It shows how the epidemic did not merely affect adults, but seeped into the very foundations of family life, shaping the futures of the youngest members of society. A young girl swallowed her first doses in search of her mother's affection, but the habit became her cage. Dependency grew in silence, mistaken for delicacy, while her future narrowed to the reach of a bottle. What looked like care was in truth the seed of lifelong captivity. Doctors in Victorian London were often regarded as the guardians of science and morality. They carried themselves with authority, their prescriptions trusted without question, their advice treated as final. Yet behind closed doors, many of these same men relied on morphine as much as the patients they advised. Some drank laudanum daily, others kept syringes in their bags for quick injections. To them, the drug was not a shameful habit but a professional tool, a way to manage the pressures of long hours and the weight of responsibility. It is strikingly hypocritical that men who consumed morphine in secret condemned women for the very same dependence. The double standard was clear. When a male physician grew pale or restless, his use of morphine was excused as the cost of his profession. He was admired for working tirelessly, even when clearly numbed by the drug. His indulgence was framed as strength, a necessary aid to maintain his practice. Society looked past his hollow eyes and trembling hands, choosing instead to praise his dedication. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like applauding a surgeon for operating under heavy medication, while scolding a mother for taking the same pills to survive her daily life. Women, however, faced a harsher reality. When their dependence grew visible, they were not excused but condemned. Neighbours whispered about weakness, husbands complained of moral decline, and doctors labelled them unfit for their roles as wives and mothers. Addiction in women was not seen as the consequence of a medical culture drowning in opium, but as evidence of personal failure. Many were sent away to asylums, their conditions described not as chemical dependency, but as madness or hysteria. I find it bitterly unfair that women were punished for trusting prescriptions, while men who provided those prescriptions indulged freely in the same poisons. Inside these asylums, women endured treatments that did little to address the cause of their suffering. Some were forced into isolation, others subjected to cold baths or restraints. The drug that had ensnared them was rarely acknowledged as the true culprit. Instead, their silence, their weakness, or their supposed disobedience to social norms was blamed. In this way, addiction became another weapon for controlling women, another means of dismissing their voices and denying their autonomy. The hypocrisy extended beyond the medical profession. Husbands who themselves drank heavily or relied on laudanum could accuse their wives of being unfit mothers when they exhibited the same habits. Society forgave men for their excesses while condemning women for theirs. A man who used morphine was stressed, overworked, or tragically human. A woman who used morphine was corrupt, fallen, or dangerous. This division preserved male authority while silencing female suffering, ensuring that the epidemic cut deeper into women's lives. The culture of silence that surrounded male dependency allowed the epidemic to thrive unchecked. Physicians who were themselves addicted could hardly campaign against the drug without implicating their own practices. Instead, they deflected blame onto women, describing them as particularly susceptible to moral weakness. Scientific language was twisted to uphold social prejudices, reinforcing the belief that women's bodies and minds were fragile. The reality that men in positions of authority were equally dependent was buried beneath layers of denial. This injustice compounded the suffering of women already trapped in cycles of dependency. Instead of receiving compassion or treatment, they were stigmatized and cast aside. Families distanced themselves from mothers, daughters, or sisters who became visibly dependent, ashamed of the supposed disgrace. The stigma made it nearly impossible for women to seek help. Admitting to addiction risked not only social ruin but confinement in institutions where conditions were worse than at home. Meanwhile, male physicians continued their habits with impunity. They wrote prescriptions in the morning, took doses in the afternoon, and delivered lectures in the evening. Their authority shielded them, and their gender excused them. They could stumble through society with bottles hidden in their pockets, their reputations intact. Women, by contrast, could lose everything for the same weakness. The epidemic revealed not just a medical crisis, but a profound inequity embedded within Victorian culture. The contradiction between the ideal of the Virgin Queen image of morality and the reality of poisoned households became sharper in this context. Women were held to standards of purity and self-control, yet they were supplied with the very tools of destruction by men who indulged themselves freely. This hypocrisy was not hidden. It was visible in homes, hospitals, and courts, but it was normalized by repetition. Over time, people stopped questioning why one group was forgiven and the other condemned. The stories of these women, erased or silenced in their time, remind us of the cruelty of such double standards. They show how power can reshape narratives, turning victims into culprits while protecting those truly responsible. They reveal that the laudanum epidemic was not only a matter of poison, but of prejudice. Not only a story of addiction, but of injustice. The bottles may have been the same, but the hands that held them were judged by entirely different rules. Doctors consumed morphine freely, excused as diligent men of science, while women were condemned as weak and immoral for the same dependency. Their silence was punished, their suffering dismissed, and their trust betrayed. The epidemic revealed not only the dangers of opium, but the hypocrisy of a society built on double standards. In the drawing rooms of Victorian London, the sight of women sleeping for much of the day was not seen as troubling, but as admirable. A lady who spent long hours in bed, or who drifted into slumber on a chaise, was praised for her refinement. Her silence was described as dignity, her stillness as composure, and her absence from daily life as evidence of delicacy. Visitors whispered that she possessed a rare and sensitive soul, too fragile for the noise of the world. It is grimly ironic that society celebrated these women for their supposed elegance, when their long sleep was the result of chemical sedation rather than natural grace. Morphine and laudanum dulled their bodies until wakefulness became a rarity. Hours stretched into half days, and half days into full days spent in bed. Husbands and families interpreted the constant sleep not as illness, but as a marker of privilege. In homes where survival often demanded ceaseless labour, the ability to sleep without interruption was envied. Few asked what sustained such unnatural rest. It was easier to admire than to question. If we imagine this today, it would be like praising someone for their calm and serene lifestyle, while ignoring that the calm comes from an endless supply of tranquilizers. The women themselves became ghosts in their own households. Meals passed without them, children played or quarrelled without their presence, and conversations moved on in their absence. Yet their withdrawal was not condemned. Instead, it was cloaked in compliments. People said they had contemplative minds or artistic temperaments. Their lack of reaction to daily life was mistaken for depth. The truth was simpler and far sadder. The drug had numbed their bodies and quieted their voices until nothing remained but stillness. Doctors reinforced these illusions. They prescribed more laudanum when women appeared restless, more morphine when sleep seemed troubled. Families trusted their authority, believing the medicine was a gift of science rather than a curse. A woman who drifted into unconsciousness was said to be recovering her strength, not losing her vitality. The authority of medicine and the culture of appearances combined to hide the truth in plain sight. I find it deeply disturbing that entire communities mistook sedation for refinement, applauding what was in reality a sign of decline. The longer the sleep continued, the more it shaped identity. Women who once laughed loudly or spoke freely were slowly remembered only as quiet figures resting in their rooms. Their past vitality was forgotten, replaced by new reputations for being serene and controlled. Neighbours and relatives repeated the story until it became true. A woman's life was redefined not by what she had been, but by what the drug had made her. The silence of her sleep turned into her legacy. The consequences were profound. Children grew up with mothers who were more often absent than present, whose affection was measured in fleeting moments between doses. Husbands built routines that no longer depended on their wives' participation. Servants learned to move through the house without expecting instructions. In this way, the drug reshaped entire households, not only the women who consumed it. The long sleep of a mother or wife created ripples that touched everyone around her, The cultural celebration of this state prevented meaningful change. Instead of recognizing addiction, society dressed it as a virtue. Women who rarely spoke were called wise. Women who rarely moved were called graceful. The absence of emotion was called composure. Each misinterpretation allowed the epidemic to spread further, ensuring that countless women remained trapped in cycles of sedation without ever being recognized as victims. Admiration became another form of neglect. For many women, there was no clear line between choice and necessity. What began as a remedy for pain or sleeplessness became an indispensable routine. The drug promised calm but delivered emptiness. They clung to it because they could not face life without it. Yet in doing so, they lost the very life they sought to manage. Their families, unwilling to confront the truth, continued to supply them with doses, reinforcing the illusion of delicacy. The longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine any other way of living. The image of women sleeping 16 hours a day captures more than personal tragedy. It represents the collision of medical practice, cultural expectation, and silent suffering. It shows how a society obsessed with appearances could turn illness into elegance, and how authority could transform poison into prestige. The women who spent their lives in dreamlike states were not admired because they were free, but because they conformed to an ideal of quiet submission. Their sedation fit neatly into a world that valued silence in women more than presence. In the end, the admiration of these endlessly sleeping women reveals one of the darkest contradictions of Victorian life. It was a culture that punished female vitality as improper, while rewarding numbness as refinement. These women were praised for what the drug erased rather than for who they were. The tragedy was not only their lost lives, but the way those losses were mistaken for virtue. Women who slept away their days were praised as refined, their silence and stillness mistaken for depth. Families admired the calm without acknowledging the drug that created it. What society called elegance was, in truth, the quiet devastation of addiction. Children in Victorian London often did their lessons at tables shared with bottles of laudanum. The smell of the drug hung in the air, faintly sweet, drifting from glasses, spoons, and half-empty vials. For them, it was as ordinary as the smell of bread or tea. While other households might be marked by coal smoke or damp wood, theirs was marked by the odour of opium. They bent over their copybooks and sums while their mothers sat nearby, eyes heavy, bodies slumped in chairs. The children adjusted quickly. They learned that a mother who drifted into silence was not to be disturbed. They spoke less, listened more, and slowly grew into habits of quiet that mirrored the atmosphere of the home. It is cruelly ironic that what should have been a place of learning and nurture became instead a classroom where silence was the first lesson. The presence of laudanum was constant. Bottles stood on mantelpieces, tucked into cupboards, or left beside sewing baskets. Sometimes the corks were not replaced properly, and the syrup clung to the glass in sticky rings. The children handled these bottles without fear, knowing them as part of the furniture of their lives. They rarely asked why their mothers needed them, for the answer was already assumed. Mothers were delicate, fragile, and easily tired, and the bottles were said to help. This explanation sufficed, even if it did not comfort. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like a child doing homework beside an open pack of strong sedatives, told only that it was medicine, never warned of its true danger. The effect on relationships was profound. Mothers were present in body but not in spirit. Their voices were faint, their eyes distant, their laughter rare. Children learned early not to expect attention. Stories went untold, questions unanswered, tears unnoticed. The distance between mother and child widened until silence filled it completely. What should have been spaces of warmth and guidance became cold and detached. The children, in turn, adjusted by withdrawing. They stopped asking, stopped sharing, and eventually stopped expecting altogether. I cannot help but think how tragic it is that children grew up believing neglect was natural, mistaking absence for normalcy. These households were not exceptions but common across neighbourhoods. Reports from the time spoke of children who grew up without real conversations with their mothers. They knew how to keep the house quiet, how to avoid interrupting the slumber of adults dulled by morphine, and how to take care of themselves long before they should have had to. In such homes, responsibility shifted unnaturally. Children became caretakers of themselves and sometimes even of their mothers. The natural order was inverted, yet it was accepted without question. The presence of laudanum also blurred boundaries. Children who reached for sweets sometimes found vials instead. The liquid fascinated them with its strange odour, and some tasted it, imitating the adults they saw daily. For some, this was the beginning of their own dependence. Addiction was not only inherited through the body, but also learned through imitation. The cycle that began with mothers extended naturally to children, binding families together in chains of quiet destruction. Even those who resisted the lure of the drug carried its influence. They learned habits of silence and repression. Emotions that might have been expressed openly were instead swallowed. In homes where mothers were absent in spirit, children learned that love was conditional, intermittent, or unavailable. These lessons endured long after childhood, shaping how they approached friendship, marriage, and parenthood. The epidemic did not end with the generation that first consumed laudanum. Its echoes resounded through those who grew up in its shadow. Society rarely acknowledged this damage. Families presented themselves as respectable, their homes tidy, their children disciplined. Neighbours praised their quietness, unaware that it was born of neglect rather than virtue. Teachers observed withdrawn children but had little power to intervene. The broader culture assumed that if children were clothed and fed, nothing was wrong. The reality of emotional absence was invisible to those outside the home, and so the cycle continued unchecked. The children themselves could not articulate the depth of their loss. They only knew that other families seemed louder, warmer, more alive. Their own households felt muffled, as if every word spoken had to pass through a veil. They adapted because adaptation was survival. Silence became safety, and distance became routine. By the time they were old enough to reflect, the habits were ingrained. Many entered adulthood unable to speak openly of their needs or to expect genuine attention from others. This hidden inheritance was one of the most lasting legacies of the laudanum epidemic. The drug shaped not only the bodies of those who consumed it, but also the minds of those who grew up around it. Children raised in houses perfumed by opium learned lessons about silence, absence, and resignation that no school could undo. They carried these lessons into the world, ensuring that the epidemic's damage extended far beyond those who directly consumed the drug. The tragedy was that none of this was recognized at the time. Public debates focused on women's morality, on the supposed weakness that led them to addiction. Little thought was given to the children who lived in those homes, whose lives were shaped by absence more than by discipline. Their futures were bent not by their own choices, but by the bottles that dominated their households. No reformer counted their silence as part of the cost, and no statistic measured their lost voices. In photographs of the period, children often appear stiff and unsmiling. Some of this was due to the long exposures of early cameras, but in households marked by laudanum, the stillness reflected reality. These children learned to pose, to remain still, to fade into the background. Their quietness was admired by adults who saw it as obedience, never recognizing it as the mark of neglect. In this way, the epidemic wrote itself into history not only through death records, but through the faces of silent children. In the end, the story of these children reveals how far the epidemic has reached. It was not confined to the women who consumed the drug, but extended to every corner of their households. The lessons of silence, absence, and resignation became part of childhood itself. What should have been years of learning and connection were instead shaped by isolation and quiet despair. The laudanum bottles did not only dull the women who drank from them, They dulled the lives of the children who sat beside them, doing sums and copying letters in the heavy air of addiction. Children studied at tables where laudanum bottles sat in plain sight, their lessons shaped by silence rather than guidance. Mothers drifted into absence, and children grew into quietness mistaken for obedience. The cost of this epidemic was not only in bodies lost, but in voices that were never allowed to grow. A woman lay in her bed during the still hours of the night, her body heavy with the weight of countless doses taken over the years. The house around her was quiet, her husband and children asleep in nearby rooms. She stirred suddenly, her eyes wide, her breath uneven. For a moment, she tried to steady herself, but the walls seemed strange, the furniture unfamiliar, the very air unsettling. She looked toward the man beside her and saw only a stranger. When she passed the mirror on the wall, her own reflection appeared foreign, as if the person staring back was someone else entirely. It is horrifying to imagine that a medicine once prescribed for rest could so thoroughly erase the sense of self. The long years of laudanum use had hollowed her memory. Names, places, and faces once familiar now slipped through her mind like smoke. Her children entered the room, and she could not recall who they were. Their voices reached her but did not connect. She clutched at the bedclothes, confused and terrified, unable to anchor herself in reality. What should have been a moment of recognition became instead a night of terror, as her entire world dissolved into fragments. If we think of it today, it would be like waking in your own home and finding every detail alien, your family reduced to strangers, your identity gone with a single glance. Her husband, long accustomed to her dependence, finally recognized that the situation had reached a breaking point. He tried to calm her, but she recoiled, frightened by his unfamiliarity. The children cried quietly, not understanding why their mother could not see them for who they were. In desperation, he called for help. The carriage arrived in the early hours, and she was taken from her home, wrapped in blankets, her eyes darting with panic. The destination was the asylum, a place whispered about in dread, where many women were sent, but few ever returned. The asylum doors closed behind her, and with them closed the last remnants of her ordinary life. Doctors and attendants labelled her condition as madness. They did not speak of laudanum or morphine. They spoke instead of female weakness, of hysteria, of mental decline. The truth, that the years of overuse had unravelled her mind, was ignored. She became another patient in the long wards, a figure lost among others whose lives had been similarly hollowed out. I cannot help but feel sorrow for how easily society mistook the effects of its own prescriptions for signs of insanity, condemning women to silence rather than admitting fault. Inside the asylum, she drifted further into confusion. The walls were bare, the routines rigid, the attendants distant. She no longer recognized visitors, and soon they stopped coming. Her husband returned to his daily life. Her children grew without her, and her identity faded completely. For them, she was gone, though her body remained. For her, the world was nothing but shadows and fragments, too disjointed to form meaning. The asylum became her final home, its silence deeper than the one that had filled her house. Her story was not rare. Many women who consumed laudanum for years reached a similar breaking point. Memory loss, confusion, and disorientation were common consequences of prolonged use. Yet these outcomes were never tied publicly to the drug. Families spoke of fragile nerves or sudden decline. Doctors protected their authority by blaming women's supposed weakness. The bottles that had emptied on bedside tables were quietly forgotten, replaced by new narratives that absolved everyone but the victim. The tragedy of her life reflects the broader cruelty of the epidemic. She had trusted her doctors, trusted her family, and trusted the society that told her the drug was safe. Each step deeper into dependence had been framed as care. Each dose had been offered as kindness. Yet in the end, she was abandoned, cast into an institution where her suffering was explained as her own failing. The hypocrisy was immense, but it was buried beneath the appearance of order and morality that Victorian society prized. For the family she left behind, the silence was convenient. A wife lost to madness was less scandalous than a wife destroyed by addiction. A mother's absence could be explained to neighbours without raising questions. Life went on, tidy on the surface, while the truth remained hidden. The children grew, carrying with them the memory of her absence, never fully understanding what had stolen her away. The cycle continued as other mothers and daughters followed the same path, their stories ending in the same wards. The image of her standing before a mirror, unable to recognize her own reflection, captures the depth of the devastation. Addiction did not only weaken the body, it unraveled the very sense of identity. To live without knowing who you are or where you belong is perhaps the greatest loss of all. Her fate was sealed not by her own choices, but by a culture that praised appearances and silenced truth. In the end, her story reminds us that the cost of the laudanum epidemic was measured not only in deaths, but in lives erased while still breathing. The women who wandered asylum halls, confused and forgotten, bore witness to the silence of an entire society. They lived as ghosts long before they died, their names preserved only in records of madness, never in the acknowledgement of what had truly destroyed them. A woman lost her memory to years of laudanum, mistaking her own family for strangers until she was taken to an asylum. Her identity dissolved in silence, her suffering dismissed as madness rather than addiction. What remained was not a life, but an existence emptied of self. Funeral rooms in Victorian London were filled with fragrance, not the stench of decay. When a woman died, her body was wrapped in linen soaked with lavender or rose water. Family members stood nearby, comforted by the sweet perfume that masked what lay beneath. Her face was powdered, her lips touched with a faint line of colour, her gown pressed and smoothed so she appeared to rest peacefully. The scene reassured those who gathered, suggesting that she had left the world gently. It is almost grotesque that such careful rituals of beauty were used to conceal deaths caused by the very substances that society refused to name. The truth inside the body was different. Years of laudanum and morphine had left organs swollen, brittle, and broken, livers hardened, kidneys inflamed, lungs heavy with fluid. Yet none of this could be seen once the surface was polished. The embalming and flowers preserved an illusion that death was natural, graceful even. Families embraced this comfort, choosing to believe in fragility rather than in the brutal truth of addiction. If we compare this to today, it would be like hiding the cause of death from cigarettes by dressing the deceased in athletic clothes and praising their supposed vitality. Mourning customs reinforced the silence. Death certificates listed vague causes, weakness, fatigue, heart failure. Rarely did they mention opium. This omission preserved reputations and avoided scandal. To speak of addiction would be to accuse families, doctors, and society itself of complicity. It was easier to let the lavender speak in place of honesty. Neighbours brought condolences, priests offered blessings, and the truth was buried with the body. The women themselves were denied even the dignity of accurate remembrance. Their suffering was erased, their struggles unacknowledged. Instead of being seen as the victims of a dangerous epidemic, they were remembered as delicate souls whose health simply failed. Their deaths became part of the larger illusion that laudanum was safe, that society's routines were harmless, that tragedy was fate rather than consequence. The epidemic endured because every individual loss was masked beneath layers of ritual. Funerals, with their rigid etiquette and floral perfumes, served as the final stage of denial. Children looked upon their mothers and saw peaceful faces, unaware of the torment that had consumed them. Husbands accepted the narrative that frailty had overcome their wives, never questioning the bottles left behind in bedrooms and cupboards. Entire communities participated in the concealment, ensuring that the epidemic remained invisible even as it claimed more lives. This concealment was not only about death, but also about appearances in life. Victorian culture prized order, cleanliness, and propriety. A chaotic, drug-ravaged end did not fit within this framework. By covering the truth with fragrance and ritual, families aligned death with the values they cherished. They transformed decay into beauty, weakness into elegance, suffering into serenity. Yet in doing so, they denied the reality that could have spurred change. For reformers who tried to raise an alarm, these customs posed obstacles. How could they convince society of the dangers of laudanum when every funeral looked like a scene of calm departure, without visible evidence? Warnings sounded like exaggerations. The rituals that preserved dignity also preserved silence, preventing honest discussion of the scale of the epidemic. Death, like addiction, became something to be hidden rather than confronted. The weight of this denial fell hardest on the next generation. Children who grew up among these rituals never learned the true reasons their mothers and aunts died. They carried forward the same habits, unprepared for the dangers. Families repeated the cycle, each believing that their tragedies were unique rather than part of a wider pattern. The epidemic spread not only through medicine and markets, but through the silence of lavender-scented funerals. The cruelty lies in how completely these rituals inverted truth. A body devastated by years of dependence was presented as peaceful and refined. A death that should have been a warning became instead a reassurance. Society comforted itself with beauty, even when beauty was false. The epidemic continued because people chose to look at the surface and ignore what lay beneath. The image of a woman lying in her funeral gown, surrounded by flowers, captures the contradictions of the time. She was dressed as though she had lived a life of refinement, though her end had been shaped by addiction. Her family wept at her side, yet they remained silent about what had brought her there. Lavender filled the air, but the unspoken truth lingered silently, heavier than the fragrance that concealed it. In the end, these deaths remind us how much society values appearances over reality. The epidemic's toll was not only hidden in statistics, but disguised in rituals that transformed poison into poetry. Women's bodies became canvases upon which society painted its illusions, even in death. What was lost was not only life but honesty, buried beneath the scent of flowers and the weight of silence. Women were buried in gowns and lavender, their deaths disguised as serene and natural. Families comforted themselves with beauty, while the reality of addiction lay hidden beneath the surface. The epidemic endured, strengthened by rituals that transformed suffering into silence. Dust often settles thickly across the attics of old Victorian houses, but beneath it, small bottles still gleam faintly. They are fragile, light enough to break between two fingers, yet strong enough to survive more than a century of neglect. Some lie wedged between floorboards, others remain tucked inside carved wooden chests, and many sit forgotten in the backs of cupboards that no one has opened for decades. Their labels are worn to near invisibility, the paper browned and flaking, the ink blurred beyond recognition. Still, if one lifts the stopper, a faint sweetness escapes, carrying the ghost of laudanum into the air. It is not the sweetness of comfort, but of deception, the scent of a cure that was never safe. It feels almost laughable that such a pleasant fragrance masked such merciless destruction. These bottles are not merely curiosities. They are the quietest survivors of an epidemic that erased lives without recording their names. To the families who once owned them, they were nothing special. Mothers left them beside the bed, grandmothers stored them in kitchen drawers, and daughters learned to measure drops without instruction. The bottles blended into daily life so seamlessly that their presence was rarely questioned. That normality is what makes their survival so chilling. They are ordinary objects that carried extraordinary weight, proof of how dependence was woven into the fabric of Victorian domestic life. Looking at them now is like finding modern bathroom cabinets filled with containers of rat poison packaged as candy. The thought is absurd, yet it echoes the same blindness that once ruled. The beauty of these bottles was part of their deception. Many were made with clear or gently tinted glass, adorned with lettering in gold or silver. Some were decorated with delicate patterns, designed to suggest refinement. Displayed on shop counters, they looked as desirable as perfumes or soaps. Yet that beauty concealed danger, and even today the sight of their empty shells carries a strange heaviness. The contrast between elegance and death is sharp enough to unsettle anyone who studies them closely. I find it hard to shake the image of children playing in the same rooms where such bottles stood, their laughter brushing against the silent witness of poison. Inside abandoned houses, these remnants often stand alone where families once gathered. The rooms are quiet now, stripped of voices, laughter, and grief. Dust covers furniture, and wallpaper peels in strips, but the bottles remain upright, patient and mute. They are not dramatic ruins or monuments, just forgotten objects that carry history without demanding attention. Their silence is what condemns the loudest. Each one insists that women's suffering was real, that it existed in every district, and that it left behind traces even when society tried to erase them. Collectors occasionally stumble across them in antique markets, often charmed by their old-fashioned design. To the unknowing eye, they seem harmless, perhaps even decorative. Few realise that they once carried enough laudanum to silence a body within hours. The marketplace treats them as nostalgic relics, tokens of a past era, yet for those who understand, they are gravestones disguised as glass. Their survival is not a cause for celebration but for unease, because they are reminders of suffering that never received justice. The persistence of their scent is particularly haunting. Time has stripped away liquid and label, but a faint aroma still clings stubbornly inside. That sweetness is almost pleasant, yet it hints at the lives that ended because of it. It proves that poison does not disappear entirely, even when its victims are long gone. The past has a way of leaving fingerprints, and laudanum left them in the air as much as in the bodies it destroyed. Anyone holding such a bottle today would be carrying not just glass, but memory. The bottles also function as archives, though not in the way official records are intended. Death certificates from the time rarely mentioned laudanum. Doctors wrote weak heart, hysteria, or decline. The truth hid behind polite words, ensuring that statistics never told the full story. These bottles, silent as they are, reveal what paper concealed. Their abundance in homes across the country demonstrates that the drug was not occasional but constant, not rare but routine. They testify to a hidden epidemic that consumed without being named, for the families who lost mothers, sisters, and daughters. The bottles were sometimes the last things left behind. Photographs faded, letters were discarded, and graves often went unmarked. But glass endured. It endured long enough to outlast generations and to remind the present of what the past refused to face. Each one carries absence, the hollowness of lives cut short, and the ache of grief never acknowledged. They are relics not of empire or wealth, but of neglect, careless and cruel. What remains most disturbing is how ordinary they appear. Unlike grand ruins or monuments, these bottles blend into their surroundings. They could be mistaken for containers of ink, perfume, or vinegar. Their very normality is the point. Dependence was normalized, danger was normalized, and grief was normalized, so that no one questioned what was in their hands. That is why they remain so powerful today. They force us to confront how easy it is for a society to accept harm when it arrives in a familiar shape. The last traces of laudanum in Victorian homes are not dramatic discoveries but quiet truths. Empty bottles tell of full lives drained away, of trust misplaced, of silence imposed. They sit in the dust, still carrying faint sweetness, as if refusing to let us forget. They are not gone, and neither is the story they whisper. The bottles that remain are fragile monuments to lives erased. They linger in forgotten spaces, offering mute testimony to the epidemic no one wanted to name. Their presence forces us to wonder what other dangers were hidden in plain sight. In one corner of Victorian London, there lived a family whose story seemed unremarkable at first glance. A grandmother, her daughter, and then her granddaughter, all passed quietly through the decades, each remembered for their delicate health and their gentle manner. Neighbours described them as soft-spoken, refined, and calm, women who rarely raised their voices or caused disturbance. What no one admitted aloud was that all three shared the same silent companion bottles of laudanum purchased faithfully from the same chemist for more than half a century. It is chilling to think that a family's identity, praised as refined and tranquil, was in truth written by the constant haze of opium. The pattern began with the grandmother, who first turned to laudanum during her childbearing years, prescribed for pain, exhaustion, and sleeplessness. The medicine became part of her daily life. As her body weakened, she relied on it more, until every day was measured by doses. When her daughter grew restless as a young woman, the grandmother offered her the same solution, explaining that it brought relief and composure. The act was not presented as dangerous but as caring, as though she were passing down a family remedy. If we imagine this today, it would be like a grandmother introducing her daughter to strong sedatives as casually as sharing a family recipe, a gesture of love that concealed disaster. The daughter, in turn, carried the habit into her own household. Her reliance deepened during marriage and motherhood, when expectations pressed heavily upon her. Neighbours noticed her quiet demeanour and thought it admirable. Her husband saw her stillness as obedience. In truth, she drifted further into dependence, her days blurred by the drug's grip. By the time her own daughter came of age, laudanum bottles were fixtures in the home, no more remarkable than teacups or candles. The granddaughter grew up surrounded by their presence, the scent of opium as familiar as the smell of bread baking in the kitchen. To her, dependence was not strange but ordinary. When the granddaughter faced the pains of adolescence, she, too, was guided toward the chemist. There, behind polished counters, the same man who had supplied her mother and grandmother handed over bottles without hesitation. The family's loyalty was praised, and the prescriptions filled without question. No one wondered why 3 generations all carried the same weariness, the same absent gaze, the same drifting manner. For the chemist, it was business. For the family, it was tradition. The chain continued unbroken. The silence surrounding their lives was profound. Neighbours who noticed the pattern never voiced suspicion. Friends offered sympathy for their delicate constitutions. Husbands and sons avoided asking questions, preferring comfort over confrontation. Each generation slipped into the same cycle, and each was buried with the same gentle words about fragility and refinement. No one spoke of the bottles that had shaped their lives, or of the chemist who had quietly sustained their dependence year after year. I cannot help but feel sorrow that love, habit, and trust combined so seamlessly to deliver 3 women into the same fate. The story of this family is not unique. Many households passed addiction from one generation to the next, disguised as care. Mothers gave daughters the same remedies they had been taught to trust, unaware that they were planting seeds of destruction. The epidemic endured not only because of doctors and chemists, but because of families who mistook poison for protection. These cycles were invisible to history because they left little scandal. Each death was explained away, each life remembered politely, the truth buried with them. The grandmother, mother, and daughter all died in similar ways quietly, in their own beds, their bodies worn down by years of constant use. Each funeral followed the same pattern, with lavender-scented cloths and polished gowns, each eulogy praising their gentleness. From the outside, it appeared that they had lived respectable lives and died natural deaths. In reality, they had been erased by the same drug, supplied from the same shop, under the same silence. The repetition of their story is what makes it most haunting. It was not an accident or a rare misfortune. It was a chain of tragedy forged by habit and denial. The chemist who supplied them left no record of doubt. For him, the bottles were routine, the customers dependable. He saw generations grow and wither, yet he never asked why they all carried the same burden. Perhaps he did not wish to know, or perhaps business mattered more than truth. Either way, his role was central. Without his bottles, the family might have broken the cycle. With them, they remained trapped until the end. This story reveals the depth of the epidemic's reach. It was not simply about individuals, but about entire lineages reshaped by dependence. Addiction became inheritance, passed down not through blood, but through bottles. The result was families hollowed out across generations, their lives shortened, their voices silenced. The tragedy was not only in their deaths, but in how normal it seemed at the time. In the end, the tale of 3 women lost to the same chemist's hand captures the quiet devastation of the Laudanum era. It shows how habit can disguise harm, how love can spread destruction, and how silence can preserve tragedy across generations. Their lives remind us that epidemics do not always roar through history. Sometimes they move quietly, from mother to daughter, one bottle at a time. A grandmother, a mother, and a daughter all lived and died under the haze of laudanum, their lives shaped by bottles passed down like heirlooms. The chemist's role remained unquestioned. Neighbours stayed silent, and 3 generations were lost to the same quiet disaster. Widows who survived into old age in Victorian London were often spoken of as fortunate, praised for their longevity as though it were a sign of resilience. In truth, some of these women reached 80 not because their bodies were strong, but because they had been numbed into stillness by decades of laudanum and morphine. Their lives stretched on, yet they lived in a haze. The quiet houses where they spent their final years were not filled with wisdom or memory, but with silence, interrupted only by the ritual of another dose. It is unsettling to think that what was admired as endurance was in fact a slow-motion collapse sustained by addiction. Their rooms were dim, curtains drawn to keep out the sun that hurt their fragile eyes. Days blended into one another as they drifted between shallow sleep and clouded waking. Meals were small, often ignored, while the bottle on the table received constant attention. Visitors rarely heard them speak of anything but discomfort or the need for medicine. Their children and grandchildren meant to inherit stories and lessons, instead inherited silence. If we compare this to today, it would be like visiting an elderly relative celebrated for long life, only to find that they remember nothing beyond the routine of their medication. Families cared for these women with a strange mixture of duty and distance. They brought food, adjusted pillows, and ensured bottles were never empty. Yet the women themselves seemed half absent, like shadows that lingered after a candle had been blown out. Relatives described them as delicate, refined, or contemplative. But these words disguise the truth. They were ghosts of themselves, alive in body but lost in mind. I find it haunting to imagine generations of families tending to loved ones who no longer truly lived, but who could not die because the drug kept them suspended in this twilight state. The houses where they remained often felt like mausoleums. Dust collected on unused furniture, clocks ticked softly in the background, and the air carried the faint sweetness of laudanum. Neighbours admired the quiet, calling it respectability, unaware that it was the quiet of sedation rather than serenity. These women lived for decades without real engagement, their worlds shrinking until only the next dose mattered. Their longevity became a cruel parody of life, measured in years without meaning. This existence revealed another contradiction of the Victorian age. Society valued long life as proof of virtue and strength, yet it ignored the quality of that life. Widows praised for surviving into old age were rarely asked how they survived. Their silence was taken for contentment, their stillness for peace. The reality that they were paralyzed by dependence was ignored because it did not fit the narrative of moral and physical endurance that the culture celebrated. For the women themselves, the final years were a blur. They no longer remembered the details of their youth, their marriages, or even their children. Memories dissolved until only fragments remained, fleeting images that surfaced and vanished without coherence. They were left with confusion, fear, and the comforting numbness of the drug. What should have been years of storytelling and legacy became years of forgetting, where the past was irretrievable and the present incomprehensible. This slow erosion placed a heavy burden on their families. Children became caretakers. Grandchildren grew up knowing their elders only as silent figures in dark rooms. The bonds that should have tied generations together were weakened. Love remained, but it was love for a shadow, for the shell of a person who no longer existed. The women's presence was physical, but their essence was gone, erased by decades of dependence. Doctors, meanwhile, often used these cases as proof of laudanum's supposed harmlessness. They pointed to elderly women still alive and argued that the drug could not be so dangerous. They ignored the reality of those lives, focusing only on the number of years rather than their content. This blindness allowed the epidemic to continue, supported by the illusion that longevity equaled safety. The truth, that these women had survived only in the narrower sense, remained unspoken. The tragedy of these widows lay not only in their own suffering, but in the silence that surrounded them. They represented the endurance of the epidemic across generations, the proof that dependence could last a lifetime. Yet they were hidden in plain sight, admired for their supposed strength while embodying the devastation of addiction. Their long lives were not victories, but indictments of a society that confused sedation with serenity. The image of a woman in her 80s, sitting quietly in a darkened room, her family moving around her with hushed voices, captures the essence of this cruel contradiction. She was alive, but not living. She was present, but not herself. Her body endured, but her identity was gone. Her survival became another illusion, one more mask that allowed Victorian society to ignore the epidemic that consumed it from within. In the end, these widows remind us that life measured only in years is a poor measure indeed. They reveal how a culture desperate to preserve appearances could turn suffering into an object of admiration, mistaking numbness for dignity. Their longevity was not a triumph but a testimony to the devastating hold of laudanum, which kept them breathing long after their lives had already slipped away. Widows lived long lives in body but hollow ones in spirit, sustained by decades of laudanum. Families mistook sedation for serenity, praising what was only a prolonged absence. Their survival was not strength, but the lingering shadow of addiction. In the later decades of the Victorian era, a few younger doctors began to question the endless prescriptions that filled homes with laudanum and morphine. They looked at the pale faces of their patients, the trembling hands, the vacant eyes, and they recognized patterns that older physicians refused to see. These young men spoke cautiously at first, suggesting moderation, asking whether perhaps the drug did more harm than good. But their voices were dismissed. Established doctors, proud of their authority, called them inexperienced, untested, and naive. It is darkly ironic that the ones who saw the truth most clearly were silenced not because they were wrong, but because they were young. Some of these doctors tried to keep records, noting that patients who used laudanum regularly grew weaker rather than stronger. They described symptoms that matched poisoning more than recovery. Yet when they presented these findings, their elders scoffed. For generations, opium had been praised as medicine, and reputations rested on its continued use. To question it was to question the very foundation of Victorian medical authority. Few dared to risk the anger of their colleagues or the loss of their standing. If we compare this to today, it would be like a junior doctor warning against overprescribed sedatives, only to be told by senior staff that the practice must continue to preserve the hospital's reputation. Private hospitals were among the worst offenders. They catered to wealthy families who expected quick solutions for discomfort. To admit that morphine or laudanum caused harm would have endangered their business. Patients who came seeking relief wanted results, and hospitals delivered by continuing to distribute the very drugs that sickened them. In quiet corridors, nurses administered doses without hesitation, while administrators kept records vague to protect their institutions. The money that flowed in was worth more than the warnings of cautious voices. I cannot help but feel anger that the preservation of image mattered more than the preservation of life. The public, too, resisted the idea that their trusted remedies were dangerous. Families clung to bottles not only out of habit but out of belief. These medicines had become part of identity, part of culture, part of daily life. To hear that they were poisoned would have been too much to accept. The voices of reformers were drowned out by denial. Newspapers that tried to raise an alarm were accused of exaggeration, while advertisers continued to print elegant illustrations of happy households improved by laudanum. The truth had no space to breathe. As a result, the warnings of younger doctors became whispers lost in the noise. Some gave up their campaigns, returning to safer ground within their profession. Others persisted, but their careers faltered. Patients trusted doctors who offered certainty, not doubt. Families sought comfort, not caution. In such an environment, it was nearly impossible to build momentum for reform. The silence of the establishment weighed heavily than the scattered words of dissent. The consequences were devastating. By the time a broader recognition of the epidemic began to take shape, countless women had already been consumed by the drug. Their lives had ended in silence, their deaths recorded without mention of the cause. Generations of children had grown in homes marked by absence and neglect. The early warnings, if heeded, might have spared them. Instead, they were ignored until the damage was irreversible. The story of these doctors highlights the inertia of institutions. Medicine, like society, clung to what was comfortable rather than what was true. The profession that should have been the first to protect women from harm became instead one of the last to admit its role in sustaining it. The younger voices were not simply rejected, they were punished, branded as reckless, their caution reframed as weakness. In this way, the epidemic was preserved by the very hands meant to end it. The hypocrisy of private hospitals was perhaps the clearest symbol of this failure. Behind polished doors, they promised care while quietly perpetuating harm. Their reputations mattered more than their patients, and their elegant halls masked a cruelty as sharp as any back-alley vendors. Patients who trusted them left with bottles in hand, believing they had been healed, never knowing they had been betrayed. The cycle continued, protected by secrecy and sustained by profit. The wider tragedy is how late recognition arrived. By the time the medical establishment could no longer deny the evidence, the epidemic had already reshaped families, communities, and entire generations. Reform came not through foresight but through exhaustion, not through wisdom but through the sheer scale of loss. What should have been prevented was instead endured, repeated, and normalized until the damage was too vast to hide. In the end, the warnings of those younger doctors serve as a reminder of how truth can be silenced when it threatens authority. Their caution was not enough to break the cycle, but it preserved a record, however faint, that not all were blind. Their voices may have been buried at the time, but they speak clearly now, pointing to the arrogance and denial that allowed the laudanum epidemic to thrive. Young doctors warned of harm, but their words were dismissed, their careers diminished, and their patients left vulnerable. Hospitals protected reputations, families clung to illusions, and recognition came only when it was far too late. The cost of silence was written in the lives already lost. Silence carried its own weight in Victorian society, heavier than any words could have been. Women were taught from an early age that restraint was a virtue, that obedience was a measure of worth, and that quiet endurance reflected dignity. That lesson followed them into marriage, into motherhood, and into the sick rooms where laudanum became their constant companion. Speaking of weakness risked judgment. Naming pain risked shame. To admit dependence was to invite disgrace. Silence was therefore not a choice but an expectation, one that pressed against women until it smothered them completely. It is almost absurd that an empire that prided itself on its progress celebrated silence, even when that silence was killing its own people. Within households, silence grew into a ritual. Husbands did not ask why their wives slept long hours or why their hands trembled. Children learned not to disturb mothers who stared blankly at the fire. Servants knew better than to comment on bottles multiplying in drawers and cabinets. The absence of speech became normal, stitched into the fabric of family life. Each unspoken truth protected appearances but corroded reality. The laudanum epidemic thrived, not only because the drug was cheap and accessible, but also because silence gave it shelter. No confession meant no confrontation, and so the cycle turned endlessly. The cost of this quiet was staggering. Countless women consumed daily doses that hollowed out their bodies, yet few were remembered as addicts. Death certificates noted vague causes: decline, nervous exhaustion, or simply frailty. Families buried their loved ones under polite words that disguised what had really happened. In preserving their reputation, they erased the truth. What should have been cries of warning became whispers buried in graveyards. It is not difficult to imagine a modern parallel where a community ignores an obvious crisis just because admitting it would stain its image. The silence stretched beyond individual homes. Churches encouraged endurance, praising women who bore suffering quietly. Doctors advised calm compliance rather than curiosity. Newspapers printed stories of occasional scandal, but rarely pressed the matter further. Even reformers often stopped short, unwilling to scandalize respectable society with accusations too raw. Each institution found comfort in maintaining quiet, as though silence itself could protect the illusion of moral order. Yet that quiet allowed laudanum to settle deeper, spreading unseen. For women themselves, silence was sometimes the only shield they possessed. To confess despair might lead to accusations of hysteria. To reveal dependence risked confinement in an asylum. To question a doctor meant challenging male authority, a dangerous act. Silence kept families intact, reputations unblemished, and judgments at bay. But in exchange, it consumed health, identity, and often life itself. The cost was not measured in words withheld, but in years stolen and generations marked by grief. Children grew up in this atmosphere without answers. They saw bottles appear but never heard explanations. They noticed mothers slipping further away, but were told nothing. Silence shaped their understanding of illness and loss, leaving them uncertain of what had really happened. Some carried the habit forward, falling into the same patterns without knowing why. Others lived with shadows, haunted by a sense of tragedy they could not name. I cannot help but think that the silence was a second poison, layered atop laudanum, ensuring the damage lasted far longer than the drug itself. Silence also reinforced inequality. Men's addictions, whether to alcohol, opium, or gambling, were tolerated or excused. Women's dependence on laudanum, however, was hidden under layers of denial. When discovered, it became a stain on character rather than a medical crisis. Silence allowed this double standard to persist unchallenged. Women were condemned without defense, erased without protest, and remembered only in vague terms of weakness. The truth was spoken too late, often by strangers piecing together evidence long after the victims were gone. In private journals, a few voices did break through. Hidden among household records and spiritual reflections, some women left traces of their struggle. They wrote of fatigue that never lifted, of nights without rest, of shame carried in silence. These words, fragile and rare, reveal how much was suppressed. Yet even these confessions were often destroyed by families after death. burned with letters or locked away from curious eyes. Silence outlived even the women who had tried to break it. The broader society also paid a price. Silence allowed the epidemic to fester unchecked for decades, robbing communities of mothers, daughters, and sisters. Families weakened by constant loss struggled to maintain stability. Generations grew up with gaps that were never filled. The labour of care fell to children too young to carry it. The absence of speech meant the absence of reform, leaving suffering to repeat endlessly. What could have been prevented with open acknowledgement stretched instead into a tragedy accepted as ordinary life. When reformers finally began to push against the tide, they faced resistance rooted in silence. Critics accused them of exaggeration, of insulting respectable families, of inventing scandal. To break the silence was to break decorum, and Victorian society valued decorum above truth. Only after countless deaths, after patterns could no longer be ignored, did change begin to flicker. Even then, silence clung stubbornly, softening the memory of what had happened, erasing details, and leaving behind only shadows. The legacy of that quiet is still visible. Today, historians trace the epidemic through the artifacts it left behind: empty bottles, fading advertisements, and scattered reports. The absence of voices in official records is its own form of evidence. The silence that once protected families has become a barrier to understanding, leaving us piecing together fragments. It is a reminder that silence does not erase suffering, but only buries it deeper. The price of that burial was a generation of women lost without recognition, their stories locked away in unspoken grief. To reflect on this silence is to feel the weight of injustice. These women did not lack words, they lacked permission to use them. Their quiet was demanded, not chosen, and it consumed them while sparing the pride of those around them. Their legacy is carried not in speeches or monuments, but in the eerie persistence of silence itself. That silence whispers through forgotten rooms, through the empty bottles, through the unmarked graves. It is the sound of lives erased while the world looked away. The insistence on silence preserved reputations but destroyed lives. Families kept quiet, institutions looked away, and an epidemic thrived under the cover of restraint. That quiet has long since broken, but the memory of its cost still lingers. Late in the evenings of Victorian London, a sound could sometimes be heard in the stillness of narrow streets and crowded homes. It was the sharp crack of glass breaking, the small shatter of a laudanum bottle slipping from a trembling hand. To outsiders it might have seemed like an accident, an ordinary noise in a city alive with movement, but to those who knew, it was something else. That sound marked another body sinking deeper into dependence, another family bound tighter in silence, another life drawing closer to its end. The breaking of bottles was not strange or rare. It was a sound woven into the rhythm of the age. It almost seems comical to think of a society so obsessed with discipline and order being defined by the clatter of bottles smashing in bedrooms and kitchens. Every broken bottle left behind more than fragments of glass. It signalled the collapse of another night's attempt at control, another measure of despair that could no longer be hidden. The pieces glittered on wooden floors or cobblestones, catching the dim light of lamps. Children sometimes picked them up, tracing the edges with curiosity, not realizing how much danger those shards once contained. Mothers swept them away. Fathers turned their eyes. Servants disposed of them quietly, and life carried on. No one spoke of what it meant. The silence, once again, swallowed the truth. The sound was familiar enough to lose its urgency. Families who lived with daily doses of laudanum came to expect it. A bottle slipping, a cork loosening, a spill staining fabric. All of these were routine, just as the cough of a factory worker meant nothing more than dust in the lungs. So too the shatter of laudanum glass became a background note in Victorian life. It should have been a cry for help, but repetition dulled its meaning. In the city's collective ear, the sound faded into normality, though it was anything but normal. If we think of it in today's terms, it would be like hearing ambulance sirens every evening and learning to treat them as the soundtrack of daily life instead of an emergency. Doctors, reformers, and even journalists occasionally drew attention to the frequency of such accidents, but their warnings rarely carried weight. Without regulations strong enough to stop the trade, and with families unwilling to confront the shame of dependence, broken bottles were swept away like dust. They vanished from sight, leaving behind faint smells and stained cloth. What should have sparked alarm was instead treated as an inconvenience. The quiet acceptance of this pattern reveals the deep resignation that hung over the society of the time. Those who lived through it sometimes recorded faint impressions in diaries and letters. One widow wrote of her sister, who dropped bottles so often that the sound echoed in her memory long after the house was empty. Another spoke of how she woke in the night to hear glass rolling across the floorboards, a reminder that her mother had once again reached for her dose in the dark. These fragments of memory confirm what official records rarely admit, that the epidemic was not hidden, only ignored. The bottles fell, people heard them, and they chose silence. The sound itself carried multiple meanings. To the women who dropped them, it might have been embarrassment, the reminder of failing control over trembling hands. To children, it was confusion, a noise they didn't understand but quickly learned not to question. To husbands, it was an annoyance, a sign of yet another night disrupted, and to society, it was nothing at all, just one more ordinary disturbance in a world full of harsh noises. Yet for historians, looking back, those cracks and clinks echo like alarms across time, alarms that went unanswered. The shattering of bottles also left behind a trail of evidence. Excavations of Victorian neighbourhoods often reveal fragments of laudanum containers buried in the soil. These archaeological remains confirm the scale of the epidemic in a way that words never did. They remind us that dependence was not confined to one class or district but spread across the whole fabric of society. From the poorest alley to the wealthiest townhouse, bottles broke and were discarded. They accumulated silently, forming a hidden archive of glass beneath the city. This imagery of brokenness reflects more than physical accidents. It mirrors the fractured lives left in the drug's wake. Families were broken by the loss of mothers, children were broken by grief, and communities were broken by the slow erosion of health and trust. Each piece of shattered glass symbolized another fragment of society itself, scattered and sharp, impossible to reassemble. The sound of breaking was therefore not only literal but metaphorical, though Victorians themselves did not frame it this way. To them, it was simply another inconvenience, another mess to sweep away. I find it haunting that an entire generation grew accustomed to this noise and never recognized it as the sound of collapse. Even when the bottles did not break, the weight of their presence was just as destructive. Empty containers stacked in cupboards testified to years of use. Families sometimes gathered dozens before finally discarding them, their presence almost ceremonial. When thrown into bins or rivers, they clinked together, creating their own music of loss. Whether breaking on floors or rattling in piles, the sound was always the same reminder women's lives were slipping away under the cover of normality. What lingers most strongly from these echoes is the sense of unheeded warning. Every shattered bottle was a message that went unheard, every crash a call that went unanswered. Society had grown too used to danger to treat it as urgent. In an age where disease, pollution, and industrial accidents filled daily life, one more threat blended into the background. Yet this particular danger was different, for it was preventable, avoidable, and fueled by silence. The cost of ignoring it was entire generations of women who slipped away, while glass crumbled in the dark. The image of those bottles falling remains powerful today. They remind us that destruction does not always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the slip of a hand, the crack of glass, and the silence that follows. It is easy to imagine standing in a Victorian bedroom, hearing the faint crash, and realizing too late what it meant. That realization is what history must preserve, for the people of the time chose not to. The falling of bottles was not an accident, but a language of desperation. Each sound carried a plea, each fragment held a truth, and together they marked a tragedy that few acknowledged. The price of silence had already been counted, but its echoes remain for us to hear. May this story leave you thoughtful, and may it remind you how fragile lives once were in a world that prized silence over truth. Good night, and may your rest be free of such shadows.